I spent 8 years believing my family didn't love me. 8 years of unanswered calls. 8 years of holidays alone, convincing myself I wasn't worth their time. 8 years of silence that I thought was rejection. I was wrong, but the truth was so much worse. Can you even afford to eat here? My sister Dara's voice sliced through the restaurant, loud enough for the tables nearby to hear. She laughed, looking around at our parents, our relatives. I mean, we all know your little consulting thing barely pays the bills. My father said nothing. My mother looked away. The cousins chuckled politely. I felt my face burn, the clink of expensive silverware, the weight of pitying stares, the familiar shrinking feeling I'd known my whole life in this family. Then the waiter approached, not to take our order, but walking straight toward me with a warm, respectful smile. "Welcome back, Miss Westbrook. Would you like your usual table?" My father nearly choked on his wine, and my sister's smile finally cracked. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who should know you best? My name is Holly Westbrook. I'm 35 years old, and I run one of the most respected financial restructuring firms on the East Coast. I've helped save companies from bankruptcy, preserved thousands of jobs, and built a career that most people would envy. But none of that matters when I pull into my parents' driveway. Here I'm still the daughter who was never quite enough. The drive took 4 hours, but it felt like travelling back in time. Every mile closer to my childhood home, I felt myself shrinking. The confident woman who commands boardrooms and negotiates million-dollar deals was slowly disappearing, replaced by the girl who learned early that her voice didn't matter in this family. 3 years. That's how long it had been since I last came home. And I wouldn't be here now if it weren't for that text message from my sister Dara. Not a phone call. Not a gentle conversation. Just cold words on a screen. "Dad's sick. Come home. Don't act like you don't have a family." No details about his condition. No question about whether I was okay. Just an accusation wrapped in an order. I learned later from a cousin that it was his heart. Early stage disease, the doctors said. Treatable, but serious. My father was 63 years old, and I found out he was dying the same way I'd find out about a cancelled meeting. Through a notification. I parked behind Dara's gleaming SUV and sat in my car for a long moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel. The house looked exactly as I remembered. Same white shutters, same overgrown rosebush by the porch that Mum always meant to trim but never did. Same feeling of dread pooling in my stomach. When I finally walked through the front door with my small suitcase, no one came to greet me. I could hear them in the living room. Laughter, the comfortable murmur of family conversation. I set down my bag and walked toward the sound, stopping at the threshold of the room. There they were. Mum was pouring tea for Dara, who sat in the good armchair like she owned it. Dad was nodding along to something Dara's husband Marcus was saying about a new business venture. My younger sister looked radiant, gesturing animatedly as she described some recent triumph at work. Everyone was smiling, everyone was engaged, yet no one looked up. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching my family exist without me. It was such a complete picture, such a perfect scene, and I wasn't in it. Finally, Mum glanced toward the doorway. Her expression didn't change. No surprise, no warmth, no relief that her elder daughter had arrived safely after driving for hours. "Oh, Holly's here," she said the way you'd announce that the mail had arrived. "Come in, don't just stand there." No hug, no, "How was the drive?" No, "We're so glad you could come." Just an instruction. I walked into the room and found a seat on the edge of the sofa, the spot no one else wanted. Dad gave me a brief nod, then turned back to Marcus. Mum resumed pouring tea, making sure Dara's cup was filled first. The conversation continued, as if I hadn't entered. Dara talked about her promotion. Marcus talked about investors. Mum talked about how proud she was of everything Dara had accomplished. When I tried to ask Dad about his diagnosis, Dara interrupted with a story about her latest project at work. When I attempted to tell Mum about my drive, she was already laughing at something Marcus said. I learnt to be quiet. I've always learnt to be quiet in this house. The evening stretched on, and I felt myself becoming smaller with each passing minute, invisible, familiar. Then Dara turned to me, her smile sharp as a blade. Still driving that old car, sis? She tilted her head with mock concern. I thought you'd have upgraded by now. Or is business really that bad? The question hung in the air like poison. I looked at Dara, her perfectly styled hair, her designer blouse, her smile that invited everyone to laugh along. And they did. Mum chuckled softly. Marcus smirked. Even Dad cracked a small grin before looking away. I didn't answer. I just smiled politely and excused myself to unpack. Later that night, I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the same ceiling I'd stared at for 18 years. The same water stain in the corner. The same crack running along the edge near the window. This room held every dream I ever had about escaping, about becoming someone, about proving that I was worth something. I escaped. I became someone. But lying here now, I felt exactly like the invisible girl I had always been. My mind drifted back 10 years to when I was 25 and had just landed my first major client. It was a small manufacturing company on the verge of collapse, and I had spent 3 months developing a restructuring plan that saved them. When the owner called to tell me the board had approved everything, I cried. Not because of the money, though, that was good. Because I had finally done something real, something I could share with my family. I called home that same evening, my hand shaking with excitement. Mum answered on the third ring. I could barely contain myself. Mum, I have amazing news. I just signed my first big client. They approved my entire plan and the company is going to survive because of the work I did. I cannot believe this is happening. There was a pause. Then Mum's voice flat and distracted. Holly, not now. Dara is crying. Her boyfriend just broke up with her. Don't be insensitive and brag about yourself. The line went quiet. In the background, I could hear Dara sobbing dramatically. Call back another time, Mum said. And she hung up. I never called back to share that news. I never shared any news after that. A few years later, I learnt that my parents needed money to fix the roof. A bad storm had torn off shingles and caused a leak in the attic. They didn't ask me for help. They never asked me for anything. But I found out through a cousin, and I wanted to do something. So, I sent the money through my friend Rachel, who told them it was from a community assistance fund for homeowners in need. I didn't want credit. I just wanted to help. A week later, I was on the phone with Dad about something unrelated when he mentioned it. We got lucky, he said. Some charity program covered the whole repair. Can you believe that strangers helping us out? Then I heard Dara's voice in the background. How lucky for you guys. Too bad Holly only thinks about herself. She probably doesn't even know your roof was leaking. Dad laughed softly. Well, you know Holly. She's always been off in her own world. I said nothing. I just let the conversation end and hung up. That was the moment I understood. My success was not something to celebrate in this family. It was something to hide. Every time I tried to share an achievement, I was told I was showing off. Every time something good happened to me, it was overshadowed by whatever crisis Dara was having. My joy made them uncomfortable. My accomplishments made them defensive. So I stopped. I stopped calling with good news. I stopped expecting them to care. I built my career in silence, helped them from the shadows, and accepted that I would never be the daughter they were proud of. That was the price of peace, invisibility. Now, lying in this room at 35, I realized nothing had changed. The ceiling was the same. The feeling was the same. I was still the girl who learned that shrinking was safer than shining. I heard footsteps in the hallway. For one foolish moment, my heart lifted. Maybe Dad was coming to check on me. Maybe he wanted to talk just the two of us. Maybe his illness had made him realize that time was precious and he should know his other daughter too. The footsteps stopped outside my door, then continued past. I heard him knock softly on Dara's door down the hall. "Sweetheart, you still awake?" I wanted to say goodnight. I turned over and faced the wall. Even now, even with his heart failing, I was not the daughter he thought of first. The next 2 days passed in the same suffocating rhythm. Dara dominated every conversation. Mum catered to her every need. Dad listened to her stories with the kind of attention he never gave me. I moved through the house like a ghost present, but unseen, speaking only when spoken to, which was almost never. Then came the night of Dad's 63rd birthday dinner. Dara had made all the arrangements, of course. She announced it at breakfast with the self-satisfied air of someone bestowing a great gift. "I got us a reservation at La Maison," she said, pausing to let the name sink in. "It's the best restaurant in town, very exclusive. I had to pull with some strings, but I know people." Mum clasped her hands together. "Oh, Dara, that's wonderful. You always know how to make things special." Dad nodded approvingly. "Sounds fancy. You sure it's not too expensive?" "Nothing is too expensive for your birthday, Dad." Dara smiled sweetly, then glanced at me. "Holly, you can come too. Just try to dress appropriately." I said nothing. But inside, I felt a strange twist of irony. La Maison, one of the finest restaurants in the region, a place where business leaders and executives entertained their most important clients, a place I had dined at dozens of times over the past several years. Dara had no idea. None of them did. That evening, I put on a simple black dress, understated but elegant. Dara looked me over when I came downstairs and raised an eyebrow. "That's what you're wearing? I guess it'll do." She herself was dressed in bright red, impossible to ignore. That was Dara, always needing to be the centre of attention. When we arrived at La Maison, Dara walked in like she owned the place. She gave her name to the host with exaggerated importance, and we were led to a table in the main dining room. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, soft lighting. I knew this room well. I had celebrated successful deals here, hosted clients here, built relationships that saved struggling companies here. But tonight I was just Holly, the invisible sister. We settled into our seats and the waiter brought menus. Dara immediately began pointing out dishes she had heard were excellent, as if she were a regular. Mum listened with admiration. Dad studied the prices with mild concern. I kept my head down and said nothing. The first course arrived and conversation flowed easily. Dad talked about retirement plans. Mum talked about the neighbours. Dara talked about herself. Then, between the appetizers and the main course, Dara made her announcement. "I have some news," she said, her voice rising to make sure everyone at the table was paying attention. "I got promoted last week, Senior Marketing Director. It's a huge step up." Mum gasped with delight. "Dara, that's amazing." Dad reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. You've worked so hard for this." Dara beamed, soaking in the praise like sunlight. "It wasn't easy, but I really pushed for it. The company knows how valuable I am now." The table erupted in congratulations. Mum raised her glass. Dad's eyes glistened with pride. Even Marcus Dara's husband looked smug, as if his wife's success reflected on him. Then Mum turned to me. Her expression shifted slightly, becoming polite but distant. The way you might look at a stranger you feel obligated to include. "And what about you, Holly? Still doing that consulting thing?" Before I could answer, Dara laughed. It was a light, dismissive sound. "She gives financial advice to small businesses. Probably barely covers her gas money." The table chuckled. Not cruelly, not maliciously, just casually. As if my insignificance was simply an accepted fact, something everyone knew and found mildly amusing. Dad smiled and shook his head, returning his attention to his wine. Mum patted Dara's arm and said something about how hard it was to build a real career these days. And I sat there, napkin in my lap, food turning to ash in my mouth. This was not new. This was my entire life with this family. The dismissal, the assumption that I was less than. The complete lack of curiosity about who I actually was or what I had actually accomplished. But something was different this time. Maybe it was seeing Dad's frailty up close, the way he moved more slowly now, the way he got winded climbing stairs, the knowledge that his heart was failing, that our time together was no longer infinite. Maybe it was the accumulation of years, 10 years of silence, 8 years of being erased, 3 years since I had last sat at a table with these people and swallowed my pride. Maybe I was simply tired. I looked around the table at my family. Mum, who had never once asked about my work. Dad, who had walked past my door to say goodnight to Dara. My sister, who had spent her entire life making me feel small and was still doing it now in public on what should have been a celebration for our father. And I made a decision. This would be the last time. The last time I sat in silence while they laughed at me. The last time I accepted their assumptions without correction. The last time I let Dara define who I was to the people who should have known me best. I did not know yet how things would change. I did not have a plan, but something inside me shifted like a door finally unlocking after years of being jammed shut. I was done being invisible. The main course arrived and the conversation moved on. No one noticed my silence. No one ever did. But then something unexpected happened. The restaurant manager walked past our table, a distinguished man in his 50s, whom I had met several times over the years. He glanced at our group casually, then stopped. His eyes landed on me and his expression changed. Recognition. Surprise. And then something else. Concern, maybe, or confusion about why I was sitting here being treated like this. He turned quickly and whispered something urgent to a nearby staff member. The staff member looked over at me, eyes widening. I felt the shift in the air. Something was about to happen. Dara was still talking oblivious. Mum was laughing at something Marcus said. Dad was studying the dessert menu. None of them noticed the manager straightening his jacket and walking toward our table with a look of careful determination. None of them saw what was coming. But I did. The manager stopped at our table, but he did not address the group. Instead, he leaned down slightly and spoke directly to me in a low, respectful tone. "Excuse me, ma'am. I apologise for the interruption. Would you mind stepping aside for a brief moment? I would like to speak with you privately." The table went quiet. All eyes turned to me. Dara's eyebrows shot up immediately. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the quick assessment of the situation, and then the barely concealed delight spreading across her face. She thought I was in trouble. She assumed the worst because that was the only version of me she could imagine. "What did you do, Holly?" She laughed loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Forget to tip last time? Or did you try to dine and dash?" She looked around at the family, inviting them to share in the joke. Mum smiled uncomfortably. Marcus chuckled. Dad frowned slightly, but said nothing. No one defended me. No one told Dara to stop. They all just waited, curious to see what embarrassment awaited me. I set my napkin on the table and stood up calmly. "Excuse me for a moment." I followed the manager to a quiet corner near the back of the restaurant, away from the dining room and out of sight from my family. He walked ahead of me with quick, purposeful steps, and when we reached a private alcove near the kitchen entrance, he turned to face me. His entire demeanour had changed. Gone was the polished neutrality of a restaurant professional managing a crowded evening. In its place was something closer to nervousness, even deference. He clasped his hands in front of him and lowered his voice. "Miss Westbrook, I am so sorry. I had no idea you would be dining with us tonight. If I had known, I would have arranged the private VIP room. I would have assigned our senior staff to your table personally. Please forgive me for not recognizing you immediately when you arrived." I held up my hand gently. "There's nothing to forgive. I didn't make a reservation under my name. This was my sister's arrangement." He nodded quickly, still looking uncomfortable. Of course, of course. But please, is there anything we can do to make your evening more comfortable? We can move your party to a better location. The chef would be honoured to prepare something special for you. Anything you need. Ms. Westbrook, just say the word. I looked at him for a long moment. This man had hosted me at least a dozen times over the past few years. I had brought clients here, celebrated successful deals, here recommended this restaurant to colleagues who needed to impress important guests. He knew exactly who I was and what I did for a living. He had seen me negotiate over appetizers, close agreements over dessert, and tip generously enough to ensure his staff remembered me. And now he was watching me sit at a table with people who thought I could barely afford gas money. No, thank you, I said quietly. I appreciate the offer, but I would prefer to keep things as they are. My family does not know about my work. I would like to keep it that way for now. He hesitated, clearly conflicted. Are you certain it would be no trouble at all? I'm certain. Please just treat us like any other guests tonight. He nodded slowly, though I could see he did not fully understand. Of course, Mrs. Westbrook. But if you change your mind at any point, please do not hesitate to ask. It is always an honour to have you with us. I thanked him and walked back toward the dining room. When I returned to the table, the conversation stopped. Everyone looked at me expectantly. Dara's expression was eager, almost hungry. She was waiting for the story, waiting for the humiliation she was sure had just occurred. Well, she demanded, what was that about? Did they catch you trying to sneak extra bread into your purse? She laughed at her own joke again. No one else did this time. Even Mum looked mildly curious rather than amused. I sat down and placed my napkin back in my lap. It was nothing. They confused me with someone else. Someone else? Dara's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Apparently, there's another guest they were expecting tonight. Similar description. They realised their mistake and apologised. It was a simple lie, easy to believe. Dara studied me for a moment, then shrugged and turned back to her wine. Well, that's embarrassing. Imagine being confused for someone important. She laughed again, and this time Mum joined in. But I noticed something as the dinner continued. The manager did not disappear into the back as he normally would. Instead, he stayed visible on the floor, circulating among tables, checking on guests. And every few minutes his eyes found me. Not staring, not obvious. Just glancing over with a subtle attentiveness that anyone paying attention would notice. When our waiter came to refill water glasses, he started with mine. When the bread basket was refreshed, it was placed closest to me. Small gestures barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. But they were there. The staff knew. They all knew. And they were treating me accordingly, even if my family had no idea why. Dara noticed too. I saw her watching the waiter as he carefully positioned my plate, making sure the presentation was perfect. I saw her frown when the manager personally brought over a complimentary appetizer and placed it in front of me with a slight bow, explaining that the chef wanted to thank us for dining with them tonight. Why did he give that to you? Dara asked, her voice sharper than before. I shrugged. I don't know. Maybe because I was sitting closest. She did not look convinced. Her eyes lingered on me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across her face. Something I had never seen before in all the years of her casual cruelty and confident dismissals. Doubt. For the first time in her life, Dara was not entirely sure about me. The assumptions she had built over decades, the narrative she had constructed about her unsuccessful invisible older sister, suddenly had a crack in it. She did not say anything else for the rest of the meal. But I felt her watching me, studying me, trying to figure out what she was missing. Who exactly was her sister? She did not know. And that uncertainty, that tiny seed of doubt, changed something between us forever. I did not know what happened that night in Dara's room. I only learned about it later, pieced together from things she said and things others told me. But what I know now is this: while I slept peacefully, for the first time in years, my sister was unravelling. Dara could not sleep. She lay in bed next to Marcus, who snored softly beside her, but her mind would not quiet. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the manager's face. That look of respect, that slight bow when he delivered the appetizer. The way the staff had treated me throughout the evening, with a subtle deference that made no sense given everything Dara believed about me. Something was wrong. Something did not add up. At 2 a.m, she slipped out of bed and took her phone into the bathroom, closing the door quietly behind her. She sat on the edge of the bathtub and opened up Google, typing my name into the search bar with trembling fingers. Holly Westbrook. The results loaded, and Dara scrolled through them quickly. There were articles, but not the kind she expected. No social media profiles showing off vacations or new purchases. No lifestyle posts or personal updates. Instead, she found dry mentions in financial journals, industry publications, business news archives. She clicked on one article. It was dense and technical, filled with terms she did not understand. Restructuring, debt negotiation, corporate turnaround strategies. Her eyes glazed over after the first paragraph. This could not be about me. This had to be some other Holly Westbrook, someone with the same name who actually did important work. She closed the browser and set down her phone, but the nagging feeling did not go away. The manager had known me. He had called me Ms. Westbrook with familiarity. He had offered me a VIP room. Why would he do that for someone who gave financial advice to small businesses and barely covered her gas money? Dara picked up her phone again. This time she did not search. She called. It was late, almost 3 a.m, but Dara did not care. She needed answers and she knew exactly who to ask. Her friend, Megan, worked in finance, something to do with investment banking or corporate consulting. Dara had never paid much attention to the details, but Megan would know. If there was anything to know, Megan would tell her. The phone rang 4 times before Megan answered, her voice thick with sleep. Dara, it's 3 a.m. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. I just have a random question. A random question at 3 a.m. Do you know anyone named Holly Westbrook? Does some consulting work, I think. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Dara waited, her heart beating faster than it should. Then Megan spoke, and her voice was different now. Awake, alert, almost incredulous. Holly Westbrook, of Westbrook Restructuring Group. Dara's stomach dropped. What? Dara, she's not some consultant. She's one of the rising stars in crisis management. She built her own firm when she was 28 years old. Her company has saved dozens of businesses from bankruptcy. She's known in the industry. People talk about her. Why are you asking about Holly Westbrook? Dara could not answer. Her throat had closed up. Dara, are you still there? Yeah, she managed. I'm here. Someone mentioned the name and I was curious. Well, whoever mentioned her knows someone impressive. Is this for work? Are you trying to hire her firm because I've heard she's selective about clients? No, it's nothing like that. Thanks, Megan. Sorry for waking you. She hung up before Megan could ask any more questions. The phone slipped from her hand and clattered against the tile floor. Dara did not pick it up. She just sat there on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the wall, trying to process what she had just heard. Rising star, built her own firm at 28, known in the industry, selective about clients. This was me, her older sister, the one she had mocked at dinner just hours ago for barely covering gas money, the one she had dismissed and belittled for as long as she could remember, the one she had convinced their parents was cold, selfish, unsuccessful, and unworthy of their attention. I was apparently someone important, someone very important, and at only 35 years old I had already achieved what most people never would in their entire careers. Dara's hands began to tremble. She pressed them against her thighs to stop the shaking, but it did not help. Her entire body felt wrong, like the ground beneath her had shifted and she was struggling to keep her balance. She stood up slowly and faced the mirror above the sink. Her reflection stared back at her. Mascara smudged under her eyes from the dinner she had not properly washed off. Hair tangled from restless hours in bed. Face pale in the harsh bathroom light. For 15 years, Dara had built a narrative. She was the successful sister, the beautiful one, the one their parents loved most, the one who mattered. Everything she had done, every story she had told, every subtle manipulation and casual cruelty had been designed to maintain that narrative, to keep me small so she could feel big. But what if that narrative was a lie? What if all this time I had been more successful than her? What if the sister she had dismissed as a failure was actually someone respected and admired? What if the parents who favoured Dara had simply been kept in the dark about who I really was? And worst of all, what if everyone eventually found out? Dara gripped the edges of the sink and leaned forward, studying her own face as if seeing it for the first time. She had spent her whole life competing with me, beating me, winning. But what if she had only won because she had cheated? What if the competition was rigged from the start and the only reason she looked successful was because she had made sure I looked like a failure? If Holly is actually more successful, she thought, then what does that make me? She had no answer, and that terrified her. The next morning, I came downstairs for breakfast. Mum was making eggs, Dad was reading the newspaper, Marcus was scrolling through his phone, and Dara was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of her. When I walked in, she looked up. Our eyes met across the room. And for the first time in my entire life, I did not see contempt in my sister's gaze. I did not see mockery or dismissal or the casual cruelty I had grown so accustomed to. I saw something else entirely. Fear. Dara looked away first. She picked up her coffee cup and pretended to drink, but I noticed her hands were not quite steady. Something had changed overnight, and I did not yet understand what. But I filed it away in my mind and sat down at the table, accepting the plate of eggs Mum handed me without comment. As I ate in silence, my thoughts drifted backward. Not to the dinner last night, but to the life I had left behind to come here. The life my family knew nothing about. 1 week earlier, I had been sitting in my corner office on the 30th floor of a glass tower in the city. The view from my window showed the entire downtown skyline, a panorama of buildings and busy streets that I had earned through years of relentless work. My name was on the door. My company occupied half the floor. At 35 years old, I had built something most people only dream about. That morning, I was reviewing documents for a major restructuring deal, while my assistant Nina stood by my desk, briefing me on the day's schedule. "You have 3 calls waiting," she said, scrolling through her tablet. "The first is from the legal team in Chicago. They need final approval on the merger language. The second is from a potential new client, a manufacturing company in Ohio that heard about the Williams deal. And the third is from Mr. Williams himself. He wants to speak with you personally." I nodded without looking up from the contracts in front of me. "Schedule Chicago for 11. Tell Ohio I'll call them back this afternoon. And put Mr. Williams through now." Nina disappeared, and a moment later my phone rang. I answered it and heard the warm, grateful voice of Thomas Williams, the CEO of a family company that had been on the verge of collapse 6 months ago. "Holly, I just wanted to call and thank you again. The board met yesterday and we're officially out of danger. 150 jobs saved, families who get to keep their homes, all because of you." I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a small smile. "I'm glad it worked out, Mr. Williams. Your team did the hard part. I just helped you see the path forward. Don't be modest. You saved us, and I won't forget it." We exchanged a few more pleasantries, and then I hung up. 150 jobs. Families who could pay their bills, send their kids to school, sleep at night without fear. This was what I did. This was who I was. Not someone who barely covered her gas money. Not someone who failed at life while her younger sister succeeded. I was someone who mattered, someone who made a difference. But there was no one to share it with. I thought about calling my parents. For just a moment, I imagined dialing their number and telling them what I had accomplished. Mum, Dad, I just saved a company. 150 people still have jobs because of me. Are you proud? But I knew how that conversation would go. Mum would find a way to change the subject to Dara. Dad would grunt something non-committal and ask when I was coming to visit. Neither of them would understand what I did or why it mattered. And if Dara found out, she would find a way to diminish it, to twist it into something negative, to make me feel small for even mentioning it. So, I said nothing. I carried my success alone the way I always had. Later that afternoon, my mentor Margaret stopped by my office. She was in her late 50s, a former executive who had retired early and now spent her time advising young professionals like me. She had taken me under her wing years ago, and she was one of the few people who knew the full story of my family. She sat down across from my desk and studied my face with those sharp, knowing eyes. "You're thinking about them again," she said. It was not a question. I sighed and set down my pen. My father's birthday is next week. Dara sent a text demanding I come home. Apparently, Dad has some kind of heart condition now. Margaret nodded slowly. "And you're dreading it?" "I'm always dreading it. Every time I go back there, I become invisible. They don't see me. They don't know me. They have no idea who I am or what I've built." "Then tell them." I shook my head. "You know I can't. Every time I've tried to share anything, it gets thrown back in my face. I'm either showing off or being insensitive to Dara's feelings. There's no winning." Margaret leaned forward, her expression serious. "Holly, your father is sick. You don't know how much time he has left. If you don't speak your truth now, you may regret it forever." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Do you want him to die thinking his daughter is a failure? Do you want that to be the last story he believes about you?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I turned to look out the window, at the city I had conquered, at the empire I had built through sheer determination and talent. All of it meaningless to the people who should have been proudest of me. "I don't know if it's worth the fight," I admitted quietly. "I don't know if anything I say will change how they see me." "Maybe it won't," Margaret said. "But at least you'll know you tried. At least you won't spend the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you had spoken up." She left me alone with my thoughts after that. I sat in my office until the sun began to set, watching the sky turn orange and pink over the skyline. I had everything. Money, respect, professional success, beyond what most people could imagine. But I was invisible to the people who should have known me best. I was a stranger to my own family. Was it worth breaking my silence? Was it worth the pain and conflict that would inevitably follow? I still did not have an answer when my phone buzzed with a new message. I glanced at the screen. It was from Mum. "Don't forget to send your share for the restaurant bill to Dara. She's organising everything." I stared at the words for a long moment. My share. As if I was the one who could barely afford to contribute. As if I needed to be reminded, like a child with an allowance to pay my portion of a dinner I could have bought 10 times over without noticing the expense. They still thought I was nothing. After everything, they still saw me as the struggling older sister who needed to be managed and reminded and pitied. Something hardened inside me. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe it was time to stop being invisible. I did not witness what happened next between Dara and Marcus, but I learned about it afterward when everything finally came out, and what I learned changed how I understood my sister forever. That same morning, after our strange moment at the breakfast table, Dara waited until our parents left the room. Then she grabbed Marcus by the arm and pulled him upstairs to their guest bedroom, closing the door firmly behind them. Marcus looked at her with confusion. "What's going on? Why are you acting so strange?" Dara's voice was low and intense. "Did you know about Holly?" Marcus went pale. His entire body stiffened and he took a small step backward. "Know what?" But his voice betrayed him. There was a tremor in it, a hesitation that told Dara everything she needed to know. He was not confused by her question. He was afraid of it. "Don't play dumb with me," Dara hissed. "I called Megan last night. She told me Holly runs some big restructuring company. She said Holly is a rising star in her industry. She said Holly built her own firm when she was 28 years old." Her voice cracked slightly. "Did you know about this?" Marcus closed his eyes and let out a long breath. When he opened them again, he looked defeated. "Yes, I knew." Dara felt like she had been slapped. "How long?" "About a year." "A year." Her voice rose sharply before she caught herself and lowered it again. "You've known for a year and you never told me." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he had when he was stressed. "It happened when I was looking for a new job. Remember last year when I was interviewing at different companies? There was a position at a firm that partners with Holly's company. I made it to the final round, but they rejected me." "What does that have to do with Holly?" "The hiring manager told me they needed approval from Ms. Westbrook for all senior positions. I didn't think anything of it at first. Westbrook is not that unusual a name. But then I got curious, so I looked her up." He paused, his expression pained. "It was Holly. The same Holly. Your sister." Dara stared at him, her mind racing. "And you just decided not to tell me? I thought it would make things worse. You already had complicated feelings about her. You were always talking about how she was a failure, how she never amounted to anything. I didn't want to..." He trailed off, searching for the right words. "I didn't want to upset you." "Upset me?" Dara laughed bitterly. "You let me keep mocking her for an entire year. You sat there at dinner last night while I made jokes about her barely covering her gas money. You knew the truth and you said nothing. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Marcus did not answer. But they both knew what he meant. He was trying to protect her from the truth. From the reality that her older sister, the one she had spent her entire life belittling and dismissing, was actually more successful than either of them. Dara turned away and walked to the window, staring out at the backyard where they had played as children. Her mind was spinning, trying to process what this meant. For 1 year, she could have known the truth. For 1 year, she had continued to treat me like a joke. She had told our parents I was struggling. She had made comments at family gatherings about my dead-end career. She had laughed at me, pitied me, used me as a contrast to make herself look better. And the whole time I was someone. I was someone important, someone successful, someone who had built more at 35 than Dara might build in her entire lifetime. But here was the thing that twisted inside her like a knife she had not known for certain. Marcus had hidden it from her. Megan had only confirmed it last night. So, technically, Dara could tell herself she was not deliberately cruel. She was just ignorant. Except that was not entirely true, was it? She thought back to the restaurant, the manager's deference, the staff's attention, the way everyone had treated me like I mattered. Dara had noticed it. She had felt the doubt creeping in, and instead of asking me directly, instead of wondering if she had been wrong about me, she had dismissed it. She had chosen to believe her own narrative rather than confront the possibility that she had been unfair. That was a choice, and she had made it over and over again for years. But instead of guilt, Dara felt something else rising in her chest. Something hot and fierce and ugly. Rage. How dare I be successful? How dare I build something impressive while she struggled to climb the corporate ladder? One rung at a time. How dare I sit there quietly at dinner letting her mock me, knowing the whole time that I was more accomplished than she would ever be? It felt like a betrayal. It felt like I had been playing a game, hiding my cards, waiting to humiliate her. It felt like everything Dara had worked for, everything she had built her identity around, was suddenly worthless. She was supposed to be the successful sister. She was supposed to be the one their parents were proud of. She was supposed to win. And now she realized that she had only been winning because I let her. Because I stayed silent. Because I chose not to compete. That made it worse. So much worse. Marcus came up behind her and put a hand on her shoulder. Dara, I'm sorry. I should have told you. But maybe this is a good thing. Maybe you and Holly can finally have an honest relationship. Dara shrugged off his hand. An honest relationship? She's been lying to all of us for years. She made us think she was nothing. She didn't lie. She just didn't tell you the truth. There's a difference. Is there? Dara turned to face him, her eyes blazing. She let me look like a fool. She let me say those things about her knowing they weren't true. She could have corrected me at any point, but she didn't. She wanted me to embarrass myself. Marcus shook his head. I don't think that's what happened. You don't know her like I do. She pushed past him and walked into the bathroom, closing the door and locking it behind her. She needed to think. She needed to plan. Because one thing was certain, she could not let me win. She could not let me waltz into this family and suddenly become the successful daughter, the impressive one, the one everyone admired. Dara had spent too many years building her position. She had worked too hard to be the favourite. She stared at her reflection in the mirror and whispered to herself, she doesn't get to win. Not now. Not after everything. She began planning her next move, not knowing that she had already lost. I learned the full story of how Dara's hatred began much later, when everything had already fallen apart. But understanding it helped me make sense of the sister I never really knew. 15 years ago, Dara was 17 years old. I was 20, finishing my second year of college on a full scholarship. We had never been close, but back then, the distance between us was ordinary sibling stuff. She was the younger sister who borrowed my clothes without asking. I was the older sister who left for college and rarely came home. Normal family friction, nothing more. But something happened that year that changed everything. It was a summer evening and Dara was walking down the hallway toward our parents' bedroom. She wanted to ask Mum about borrowing the car for the weekend. The door was slightly open and she could hear voices inside. She was about to knock when she heard her own name and froze. Holly called today, Mum was saying. She made the dean's list again, 3rd semester in a row. Dad grunted approvingly. That girl is going places. Always has been. She's got a sharp mind. She's doing amazing at college, Mum agreed. I told you she would. That girl is going to do great things. We don't need to worry about her. Dara stood outside the door, hand raised to knock, listening to her parents praise me. She told herself it was fine. Of course they were proud of me. I was doing well. That was a good thing. Then Dad sighed and his voice shifted to something heavier. It's Dara we need to focus on. She doesn't have Holly's mind. Her grades are average at best. She doesn't have the same drive, the same ambition. She'll need more help, more support. We have to make up for what she lacks. Mum murmured agreement. I know, I worry about her future. Holly will be fine no matter what. But Dara will have to guide her more carefully. Dara's hand dropped to her side. She stood frozen in that hallway, her heart pounding, her face burning with shame. Not as smart, lacking, needs help, make up for what she lacks. Her parents saw her as the deficient child, the one who needed extra support because she could never measure up to her brilliant older sister, the one they worried about because she was not good enough on her own. She did not knock on the door that night. She turned around silently and walked back to her room, closing the door behind her and sitting on her bed in the darkness. Something broke inside her, or maybe something hardened. Either way, she was never the same after that. In the weeks and months that followed, Dara made a decision. If she could not be better than me, she would make me smaller. If she could not rise to my level, she would pull me down to hers. She would change the way our parents saw me slowly and carefully until I was no longer the golden child, and she was no longer the disappointment. It started with small comments dropped casually into conversations. "Holly didn't call for Mum's birthday. I guess she's too busy with her fancy college friends." I had called. Mum just missed it because she was out running errands. But Dara never mentioned that part. "I tried to talk to Holly last week, but she seemed distracted. I don't think she really cares about what's happening at home." I had been in the middle of finals. I apologised and promised to call back. But Dara made it sound like I was cold and dismissive. "Holly thinks she's so much better than us now." You can hear it in her voice. "She looks down on this family." I had never said anything like that. I had never even thought it. But the seeds were planted, and they began to grow. Over time, the comments became more frequent and more pointed. Dara shaped the narrative carefully, never saying anything too extreme, never making accusations that could be easily disproved. She just nudged our parents' perceptions a little at a time until they started to see me the way she wanted them to. Holly is cold. Holly is distant. Holly only cares about herself. Holly abandoned this family. And because I was away at college and then building my career in another city, I was not there to defend myself. I did not know what was being said about me. I only knew that my calls went unanswered more often, that my parents seemed less interested in my life, that every time I came home there was a wall between us that I could not explain. I thought they were disappointed in me. I thought I was doing something wrong. I tried harder, called, more often sent money when I could. But nothing worked. The distance only grew. What I did not understand was that the distance was manufactured. Every time I reached out, Dara intercepted. Every time I tried to connect, she twisted it into evidence of my selfishness. She did not just compete with me, she erased me. 15 years. That was how long her campaign lasted. 15 years of subtle manipulation, of whispered doubts, of carefully constructed lies. And it worked. By the time I stopped trying to reach my family, they were convinced I had never cared in the first place. They believed the version of me that Dara had created, the cold daughter, the absent sister, the one who thought she was too good for them. All because a 17-year-old girl heard her parents say she was not as smart as her sister. I do not excuse what Dara did. The pain she caused me the years she stole from my relationship with our parents. The loneliness I carried because I believed my family did not want me. None of that is forgivable just because she was hurting too. But I understand it now. I understand that her cruelty came from a wound, even if that wound does not justify the damage she caused. Back in the present, Dara stood in the guest bedroom staring out the window. Downstairs, our parents were laughing at something on television, completely unaware of the truth. They still believed I was the distant one. They still thought Dara was the devoted daughter who had stayed close while I drifted away. 15 years of manipulation, 15 years of lies, and it was all about to unravel. Dara knew it. She could feel it coming like a storm building on the horizon. The cracks had already started to show. The manager at the restaurant, the way the staff treated me, the doubt she saw in Marcus's eyes. She had worked so hard to build this version of our family, and now, piece by piece, it was going to fall apart. The next morning, Dara came downstairs with a bright smile and an announcement that immediately put me on edge. "I've been thinking," she said, settling into her chair at the breakfast table with the air of someone about to bestow a great gift. "Dad's birthday dinner was lovely, but it was just the 5 of us. I think we should do something bigger, a real celebration." Mum looked up from her coffee with interest. "What do you mean?" "I mean, invite the whole family, Uncle Richard, Aunt Patricia, the cousins, everyone. Let's have a proper gathering to celebrate Dad's health and show everyone how strong this family is." She reached over and squeezed Dad's hand. "You deserve it, Dad. You've been through so much with this diagnosis. Let's remind everyone how blessed we are to have you." Dad smiled clearly, touched. "That's very thoughtful, sweetheart. But isn't it a lot of work to organise?" "I'll handle everything," Dara assured him. "You just focus on feeling better. Leave the details to me." Mum was already nodding enthusiastically. "What a wonderful idea. It's been too long since we've all been together. I'll call Patricia this afternoon." I sat quietly watching this performance unfold. Something felt wrong. Dara's smile was too bright, her generosity too sudden. She had never been the type to organise family gatherings out of pure goodwill. There was always an angle, always a purpose, but I could not figure out what it was. So, I said nothing and waited. Over the next few hours, I observed Dara making phone calls and sending texts, her energy almost manic. She confirmed guest lists, discussed menu options, and debated seating arrangements with Mum, as if she were planning a royal wedding rather than a casual family dinner. And then she announced the venue. "Yeah, I think we should go back to La Maison," she said casually, not looking at me. They were so accommodating last time. The food was excellent, and they have a private room for larger parties. Mum agreed immediately. "That's a lovely idea. It's such a nice restaurant." I felt a chill run down my spine. La Maison. The same restaurant where the manager had recognised me. The same place where the staff had treated me with deference that confused my family. Dara wanted to go back there. Why? The answer came to me slowly. And when it did, I understood exactly what my sister was planning. She wanted to watch. She wanted to see how the staff treated me again this time with witnesses. She wanted evidence that something was off, something she could use to either expose me or twist against me. If the staff treated me like a VIP, she could accuse me of putting on airs of trying to look important. If they treated me normally, she could point to it as proof that the first time was a fluke, that I was nobody special. Either way, she won. Or so she thought. What Dara did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was the history between me and that restaurant. 2 years ago, La Maison was on the verge of closing. The owner had made some bad investments, taken on too much debt, and was weeks away from bankruptcy. A mutual contact reached out to me desperate for help. I took the case, pro bono, spent 3 months restructuring their finances, renegotiating their leases, and finding new investors. By the time I was done, the restaurant was not only surviving, but thriving. The owner had wanted to put my name on a plaque in the lobby. I refused. I did not want recognition. I just wanted to help a business I believed in. But the staff remembered. The manager remembered. And every time I dined there, they treated me like the person who had saved their jobs. Dara had no idea. She thought she was setting a trap for me. In reality, she was walking into one herself. Later that afternoon, Dara found me alone in the living room. She sat down across from me with that same bright, false smile. "So," she said, "are you excited about the family dinner?" "I suppose," I replied carefully. "It's nice that you're organising something for Dad." "It is, isn't it?" She tilted her head, studying me. "You know, the relatives haven't seen you in years. They're going to have so many questions about your life, your job, your situation." There it was, the real purpose barely hidden beneath the surface. "I'm sure they will," I said evenly. "You should prepare some answers. You know how nosy Aunt Patricia can be. She'll want to know everything." Dara's smile sharpened. "I just hope you're comfortable talking about where you're at in life. It can be awkward when people are doing better than you and they ask questions out of pity." I met her gaze and said nothing. Let her think she had the upper hand. Let her believe she was in control. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text message. I looked at the screen and saw Dara's name. "Big family dinner tomorrow at the restaurant. Don't embarrass yourself trying to look important. Just be yourself. That should be humble enough." I read the message twice, letting the cruelty of it sink in. This was my sister. This was the person who shared my blood, who grew up in the same house, who was supposed to love me, and she was texting me instructions on how to be appropriately small. Something shifted inside me. Not anger exactly, something colder and more resolved. For years I had accepted my role in this family, the invisible one, the unsuccessful one, the daughter who was tolerated rather than celebrated. I had let Dara define me to our parents, to our relatives, to everyone. I had shrunk myself to fit the box she built for me, but not anymore. Tomorrow, the extended family would gather at La Maison. Dara would ask her pointed questions, try to expose me or humiliate me in front of everyone. She thought she knew how this would end. She was wrong. I did not respond to her text. Instead, I set down my phone and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. Dara wanted a show. She wanted to prove once and for all that she was the successful sister and I was the failure. Fine. Let her have her dinner. Let her ask her questions. Let her think she was in control. She had chosen the one battlefield where I could not lose. And tomorrow, she would finally learn exactly who her sister really was. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through everything that was about to happen. Dara was planning something. I could feel it in every interaction, every pointed comment, every false smile. Tomorrow's dinner was not a celebration. It was an ambush. But for the first time in years, I was not afraid. I picked up my phone and called Margaret. It was late, but she answered on the second ring as if she had been expecting me. "Holly, what's wrong?" "Dara's planning something," I said quietly, keeping my voice low so no one in the house could hear. "She's organised this big family dinner, invited all the relatives, and she's going to try to expose me or humiliate me. I can feel it." Margaret was silent for a moment. "And what are you going to do?" "I'm tired of hiding." The words came out before I could stop them. "Dad's sick. I don't know how much time he has left. If he dies thinking I abandoned him, thinking I'm cold and selfish and don't care about this family..." My voice cracked, and I had to pause to steady myself. "I can't let that happen, Margaret. I can't let him go without knowing the truth about who I really am." "Then don't," she said simply. "But I don't want revenge. I don't want to destroy Dara or humiliate her in front of everyone. I just want them to see me, really see me." "Is that wrong?" Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Holly, listen to me. You're not doing this to prove them wrong. You're not doing this to punish your sister or make yourself look better. You're doing this so they can finally see you. There's a difference." I closed my eyes and let her words wash over me. She was right. This was not about winning or losing. This was about truth, about being known by the people who should have known me all along. "What if they don't believe me?" I whispered. "What if I tell them everything and they still choose Dara's version?" "Then you'll have your answer," Margaret said, "and you can finally stop wondering. Sometimes knowing is better than hoping." After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and made a decision. I was not going to prepare attacks or rehearse accusations. I was going to gather proof, not weapons. Evidence of love. I opened my laptop and began searching through old files and emails. I found the folder I had kept for years, the one filled with messages I had sent to my parents that went unanswered. Weekly emails asking how they were doing, birthday wishes, holiday greetings, notes saying I missed them, that I was thinking about them, that I hoped we could talk soon. Dozens of them, years of them, all sent into silence. I saved copies to my phone. Then I found the financial records. The hospital bills I had paid directly to the medical centre when Dad had his first health scare 3 years ago. I had called the billing department and paid the balance myself, asking them not to tell my parents where the money came from. At the time, I thought I was being generous. Now I realized I had been enabling my own invisibility. I saved those too. And finally, I found the documentation for the home repairs. My company had a charitable arm that provided assistance to families in need. I had quietly added my parents' roof repair to the list, making it look like community support rather than personal help. Dara had mocked me for not contributing, while the whole time I had been the one paying. I saved everything. When I was done, I sat back and looked at my phone. All the proof was there. Not proof that I was successful or important. Proof that I had never stopped loving them. Proof that I had been trying to reach them for years, while someone else made sure my messages never got through. On my nightstand was an old photo in a small frame. I picked it up and studied it in the dim light. It was from my high school graduation 17 years ago. Mum and Dad stood on either side of me, beaming with pride. Dara, just 15, stood beside Mum, smiling genuinely. We looked like a happy family. We looked like people who loved each other. What went wrong? When did I become the enemy? When did Dara decide I was someone to destroy rather than someone to love? I did not have answers. Maybe I never would. But looking at that photo, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time. Grief. Not for what I had lost, but for what had never really existed. The family I wanted. The sister I wished I had. The parents who knew me. I grieved for all of it. And then I set the photo down. Grief did not mean surrender. Pain did not mean defeat. I could mourn the family I never had while still fighting for a chance at something real. I made myself a promise. Tomorrow I would not attack Dara. I would not scream or accuse or try to destroy her the way she had tried to destroy me. I would simply tell the truth. I would show them the evidence. And then I would let them choose. If they believed me, maybe we could start again. If they rejected me, even after knowing everything, then I would finally understand that it was never about what I did or did not do. It was about who they needed me to be. And I could let go. My phone buzzed. Another text from Dara. Wear something appropriate tomorrow. Don't try too hard. We all know you can't afford designer anyway. I read the message and felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, just calm. I walked to my closet and opened the door. Inside were the clothes I had brought from my apartment in the city. Simple pieces, understated but elegant. The kind of wardrobe a successful professional builds over years of important meetings and high-stakes negotiations. Tomorrow, I would walk into that restaurant as myself. Not the invisible sister, not the family failure, just Holly Westbrook. And for the first time in my life, my family would see exactly who that was. I selected my outfit and laid it on the chair. Tomorrow, the truth walks into that restaurant, and nothing will ever be the same. The restaurant was already full of familiar faces when I arrived. Through the windows, I could see relatives I had not spoken to in years gathered around a long table in the private dining room, cousins who had grown up since I last saw them, aunts and uncles who probably barely remembered what I looked like, and at the centre of it all, Dara, in a stunning red dress, commanding attention like the hostess of a grand event. I took a breath and walked through the front door. Inside, I could hear Dara's voice carrying across the room as she greeted guests and directed people to their seats. She had positioned herself as the organizer, the beloved daughter who had put this all together for their father. I watched through the glass partition as she laughed and hugged relatives basking in their admiration. Then she spotted me approaching and her smile sharpened. "Everyone Holly's here," she announced loud enough for the entire room to hear. She walked towards me with arms open, performing sisterly affection for the audience. "There you are. I was starting to think you got lost." She turned to the relatives nearby, gesturing at me with casual dismissal. "This is my sister Holly. Some of you might remember her from years ago. She does some consulting work now. Small scale, but she tries." A few relatives nodded politely, their expressions a mixture of vague recognition and disinterest. Uncle Richard, our father's older brother, looked me over with mild curiosity but said nothing. Aunt Patricia smiled in that distant way people do when they are being polite, but have already formed their opinions. I smiled back and said nothing. Not yet. I was wearing a simple black dress, elegant, well-fitted, understated. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth or success, just quiet confidence. The kind of outfit a woman wears when she knows she does not need to prove anything to anyone. But the moment I stepped fully into the room, something shifted. I noticed it first in the host's expression. He was the sire young man who had greeted us at the first birthday dinner. His eyes widened when he saw me, and he quickly excused himself from the family he was seating to hurry toward the back. Then, I saw a server whisper something to a colleague, both of them glancing in my direction with barely concealed surprise. And finally, the manager appeared. He emerged from the back of the restaurant with quick, purposeful strides, his face a mixture of delight and confusion. He walked straight toward me, completely ignoring Dara and the rest of the family. "Miss Westbrook," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. "I had no idea you would be joining us tonight. Please forgive me. If I had known, I would have arranged the private VIP suite. Is there anything we can do to make your evening more comfortable?" The room went still. I could feel every eye turning toward me. The cousins exchanged confused glances. Uncle Richard's frown deepened. Aunt Patricia's polite smile faltered. And Dara stood frozen, her carefully constructed introduction crumbling around her. The manager continued, oblivious to the tension he had created. "On behalf of our entire staff, I want to thank you again for what you did for us during our restructuring. This restaurant would not be standing today without your help. We owe you everything." Silence. Complete, absolute silence. I could hear the soft clink of glasses from the main dining room, the distant murmur of other guests who had no idea what was happening in this private space, and the ragged breathing of my sister, who looked like she had just been slapped. Uncle Richard was the first to speak. He stepped forward, his expression sharp with sudden interest. "Holly, what is he talking about?" "What restructuring?" Before I could answer, Dara jumped in. Her voice was too bright, too desperate. "I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. The staff here gets confused sometimes. Holly, tell them it's a misunderstanding." Everyone looked at me, the manager, the relatives, my parents who had been watching from their seats with growing bewilderment, and Dara, whose eyes were pleading with me to maintain the lie she had built. I held her gaze for a long moment. I thought about all the years of silence, all the times I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace, all the moments I had chosen invisibility over truth, because it was easier, because fighting seemed pointless, because I had given up on ever being seen. Not anymore. I turned to face the family, my voice calm and steady. "Actually, it's not a misunderstanding." Dara's face went pale. "But this isn't the time," I continued smoothly. "We're here to celebrate Dad. Let's enjoy the dinner." I walked past the manager with a polite nod of thanks and took my seat at the table. The family parted to let me through, too stunned to do anything else. I settled into my chair as if nothing unusual had happened, picked up my menu and began studying the options. But the damage was done. The whispers started immediately. Cousins leaning toward each other asking what just happened. Aunt Patricia staring at me with renewed interest. Uncle Richard watching me with an expression I had never seen before, something like respect. And Dara still standing near the entrance, her red dress suddenly looking less like a statement of power and more like a target. She recovered quickly, pasting on a smile and returning to her hostess duties. But the cracks were showing. The narrative she had spent years constructing was beginning to crumble. The family sat down to dinner, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Something had shifted. A timer had started. And everyone at that table knew that by the end of the night they would learn the truth about Holly Westbrook. The appetizers arrived, but no one seemed interested in eating. The energy at the table had shifted completely. Conversations were muted, distracted. People kept glancing at me when they thought I was not looking, then quickly turning away. Uncle Richard was the most obvious. He had always been the patriarch of our extended family, the one who asked hard questions and expected straight answers. I watched him excuse himself from the table midway through the first course, claiming he needed to speak with the manager about a menu question. But I knew what he was really doing. I saw him approach the manager near the back of the room, leaning in close to speak privately. The manager's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine enthusiasm as he began to explain something, gesturing with his hands, clearly telling a story he was proud to share. I could not hear their conversation, but I could guess what was being said. When Uncle Richard returned to the table several minutes later, his face was unreadable. He sat down slowly, picked up his napkin, and placed it in his lap with deliberate care. Then he looked at me. It was the first time in my life that my uncle had ever looked at me with something other than polite indifference. Now there was curiosity, respect, and a dozen questions he was clearly deciding whether to ask. He leaned toward Aunt Patricia and whispered something in her ear. Her eyes widened and she immediately turned to whisper to her daughter sitting beside her. The information rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Within minutes, I could feel the entire extended family stealing glances at me. The cousins I barely knew, the aunts who had dismissed me for years. Everyone was looking at me differently now, trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with whatever Uncle Richard had just learned from the manager. I kept my focus on my food, pretending not to notice. But inside, I felt something unfamiliar. Not triumph, not vindication, just a quiet acknowledgement that after all these years, someone outside my family was finally speaking the truth about me. My father noticed the whispers too. I saw him frowning, looking around the table, trying to understand what was happening. He caught the way the servers attended to me with extra care, refilling my water glass first, checking if my meal was satisfactory, treating me with a deference that made no sense to him. Then he looked at Dara. My sister was talking louder than usual, laughing harder, trying desperately to reclaim the attention that was slipping away from her. She complimented Mum's earrings. She asked Marcus about his work. She told a story about a project at her company that seemed to go nowhere. But no one was really listening. Everyone was watching me. Dad's frown deepened. I could see him putting pieces together, sensing that something was wrong, but not yet understanding what. His eyes moved between me and Dara, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his expression. Dara saw it too, and it terrified her. She set down her fork and cleared her throat, commanding the table's attention, with the practiced ease of someone used to being the centre of every gathering. "Okay, enough mystery," she said brightly, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Since everyone seems so curious about Holly tonight, why don't we let her tell us about herself? Holly, what exactly is this consulting business of yours? How many clients do you have?" 2, 3. She laughed as if she had made a clever joke. A few relatives offered awkward chuckles, unsure whether they should join in. I recognized the trap immediately. If I answered honestly, if I told them the truth about my company and my clients and everything I had built, Dara would accuse me of showing off. She would twist it into evidence that I was trying to overshadow Dad's celebration, trying to make everything about myself. But if I deflected or stayed quiet, I would look evasive, suspicious, like someone with something to hide. I opened my mouth to respond, still uncertain which path to take, and then someone else spoke first. "Holly Westbrook." The voice came from behind me, deep, warm, instantly recognizable. I turned to see a distinguished man in his 60s rising from a nearby table, his face breaking into a genuine smile as he walked toward our group. Thomas Williams, CEO of the Williams Family Corporation, the man whose company I had saved from bankruptcy just months ago. He approached our table with the easy confidence of someone who commanded respect wherever he went. His eyes were fixed on me with unmistakable warmth. "I thought that was you," he said, stopping beside my chair. "I couldn't believe my luck when I saw you walk in. I've been meaning to call your office to schedule another dinner." The entire table had gone completely silent. Every member of my family was staring at this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and was speaking to me like I was someone important. Dara's smile had frozen into something that looked almost painful. Mr. Williams glanced around the table, suddenly aware that he had interrupted something. "I'm sorry. Am I intruding? I didn't mean to interrupt your family gathering. I just wanted to say hello to the woman who saved my company." He turned back to me, his expression sincere. "Holly, what you did for us, I can never repay. 150 employees kept their jobs because of your work. Families who can still pay their mortgages. Kids who can still go to college. You gave us back our future." He extended his hand and I shook it, feeling the weight of every eye at the table pressing down on me. "It was my pleasure, Mr. Williams," I said quietly. "Your team did the hard work. I just helped you find the path." He laughed warmly. "Always so modest. That's what I love about you." He nodded to the rest of the family. "You should all be very proud of her. She's one of the best in the business." And then he walked away, returning to his own table completely unaware of the bomb he had just detonated. The silence that followed Mr. Williams' departure was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the weight of what had just happened pressing down on the table. My father was staring at me. Not with the usual distant acknowledgement I had grown accustomed to over the years. This was something different. He looked at me like he was seeing a stranger, like everything he thought he knew about his older daughter had suddenly been called into question. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her wineglass. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again at a loss for words. The cousins who had barely remembered my name an hour ago were now leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every detail of what had just transpired. Even the teenagers who had been bored and scrolling through their phones were paying attention now. Uncle Richard nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I could see him connecting dots, fitting pieces together that he should have noticed years ago. The manager's story, the staff's deference, and now a CEO publicly crediting me with saving his company and preserving 150 jobs. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. And then Dara broke it. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her face was flushed, her perfectly applied makeup doing nothing to hide the rising red in her cheeks. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "Enough," she said, her voice too loud for the intimate setting. Several guests at nearby tables turned to look. "This is Dad's birthday celebration, not a business networking event, not a chance for Holly to show off in front of the whole family." She pointed at me, her finger trembling with barely contained fury. "Did you plan this? Did you arrange for that man to be here tonight? Did you call ahead and tell the manager to make a big scene when you arrived?" The accusation hung in the air. I could feel the family's attention swinging between us like spectators at a tennis match, waiting to see how I would respond. I did not stand. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at my sister with the same calm I had cultivated over years of boardroom negotiations and high-stakes meetings. "I didn't know Mr. Williams would be here tonight," I said quietly. "I had no idea he was even in town. I didn't call ahead to the restaurant. I didn't arrange anything with the manager, and I have never in my entire career asked anyone to speak on my behalf." I paused, letting my words settle over the table. "I came here to celebrate Dad's birthday. That's all. Whatever people choose to say about me is their own decision. I can't control that." The contrast between us could not have been more stark. Dara stood there red-faced and trembling, practically shouting in a room full of people. I sat calmly in my chair, my voice measured and even, not a hair out of place. The family saw it. I could tell by the way their eyes moved between us, the way they shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Whatever version of me Dara had been selling them for years, it did not match the woman sitting in front of them now. Dara saw it too, and it pushed her over the edge. "You always do this," she hissed, her voice rising higher. "You always find a way to make yourself look better than me. You've been doing it our whole lives." Little Miss Perfect Holly, with her scholarships and her career and her important clients. She was losing control. I could see it in the wild look in her eyes, the way her words tumbled out faster and faster. "Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up in your shadow? To always be compared to you? To hear Mum and Dad talk about how brilliant Holly is, how successful Holly will be, how we don't need to worry about Holly?" Her voice cracked, and for just a moment I saw something beneath the anger, something that looked almost like pain. But she pushed past it, her rage taking over again. "I worked so hard to build something for myself. I worked so hard to be the daughter they were proud of. And you just waltz back in after years of ignoring this family, and suddenly everyone is falling all over themselves to praise you." Mum reached out and touched Dara's arm. "Dara, honey, calm down. People are staring." Dara shook her off violently. "I don't care if they're staring. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of acting like Holly is some kind of saint when she's the one who abandoned us." Dad's voice cut through the chaos, low and firm. "Dara, sit down." But she did not sit. She was too far gone now, too deep into the spiral she had started. "You want to know the truth?" she shouted, looking around at the family, at all the relatives who had come to celebrate our father's birthday. "You want to know what kind of sister Holly really is?" I felt my heart begin to beat faster. Something was about to happen, something I could not predict or control. "She never called," Dara continued, her voice rising to a shriek. "She never visited, she never cared about any of us. She thinks she's too good for this family. She always has." "That's not true," I said, my calm finally cracking just slightly. "I called, I sent emails, I sent birthday cards. For years." Dara laughed bitterly. "Right, sure you did. And I suppose all those messages just disappeared into thin air." The words hung in the room heavy with implication, and in that moment I understood. The truth was right there on the edge of being spoken. Dara was so consumed by her rage that she did not even realize what she was about to reveal. I looked at her across the table, this sister I had loved and lost and never understood, and I saw the mask finally beginning to slip. She was about to say something she could never take back. Dara was shaking now, her whole body vibrating with a rage she could no longer contain. Years of carefully constructed control were crumbling, and she did not even seem to realize it. "You want everyone to think you're the perfect daughter," she shouted, her voice echoing through the private dining room. "You want them to believe you're some kind of saint who was wronged by her terrible family." She stepped closer to the table, her eyes wild. "Do you know what Mum and Dad really thought about you all these years? They called you cold. They said you only cared about money and your precious career. They said you abandoned this family the moment you got the chance." She pointed at me triumphantly, expecting her words to wound, expecting me to crumble under the weight of our parents' supposed judgment. But I did not crumble. Instead, I felt something click into place. A puzzle piece I had been missing for years suddenly fit, and the picture it revealed was devastating. I looked at my sister, then at my parents, then back at Dara. My face had gone pale, I knew, but my voice stayed steady. "They said that," I repeated slowly, "or you told them to believe that." The table went completely silent. Dad frowned, his confusion evident. "What do you mean, Holly? What are you saying?" I turned to face my parents directly, ignoring Dara, ignoring the extended family, watching with bated breath. This moment was between me and the two people who should have known me best. "I called you," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "Every week. For years, I sent emails, I sent birthday cards, I sent messages asking how you were doing, telling you I missed you, begging you to talk to me." Mum's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching horror. "For 8 years, I continued, I tried to reach you, and no one ever responded. Not once. I thought you didn't want me. I thought you had decided I wasn't worth your time. I thought... My voice cracked slightly, but I pushed through. I thought you didn't love me anymore. The words hung in the air, heavy with 8 years of pain. Dad shook his head slowly, his face ashen. Holly, we never received any calls. We never got any emails or cards. We thought you were too busy for us. We thought you didn't want to be bothered. Who told you that? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mum's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes were filling with tears as she turned to look at Dara. Dara always said you were too busy, Mum whispered. She said she talked to you and you told her you didn't have time for family obligations. She said you wanted distance. She said... She could not finish the sentence. Dad's voice cracked when he spoke. She said you never called. She said you wanted nothing to do with us. She said we should stop reaching out because it only annoyed you. Every word landed like a hammer blow. 8 years of silence. 8 years of believing my family had rejected me. 8 years of loneliness and grief and wondering what I had done wrong. And it was all because of her. All eyes turned to Dara. My sister stood frozen in place, her earlier rage evaporating into something that looked almost like terror. Her face had gone completely white. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. Uncle Richard broke the silence, his voice low and dangerous. Dara, is this true? Did you tell your parents that Holly didn't want to speak to them? Dara's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, looking for an ally, finding neither. It's not... You don't understand, she stammered. Did you intercept Holly's messages? Aunt Patricia demanded, her usual polite demeanour completely gone. Did you lie to your own parents about their daughter? It wasn't like that, Dara said desperately. Holly was always the perfect one. Everything came so easy for her. I just wanted... You wanted what? Dad's voice was barely recognisable. I had never heard him sound like this before. Broken, betrayed. You wanted to take our daughter away from us. You wanted to make us think she didn't love us. I didn't take her away. She left. She went off to her fancy career and her important life, and she forgot about all of us. I never forgot, I said, and my voice cut through her excuses like a knife. I never stopped trying to reach you. But every time I called, no one answered. Every email went unanswered. Every birthday card disappeared because you made sure of it. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I had prepared. The evidence I had gathered, not as weapons, but as proof of love. I have the records, I said quietly. Every email I sent for 8 years, every call log, every message, I kept them all because I couldn't understand why my family had abandoned me. I set the phone on the table in front of my parents. I never abandoned you. I was erased. Mum let out a sob. Dad stared at the phone like it contained the answers to everything that had gone wrong in our family. And Dara stood alone, surrounded by relatives who were looking at her with expressions ranging from disbelief to disgust. She opened her mouth again, searching for words, searching for some explanation that would make this better. But there was nothing she could say. For 8 years, my parents had believed their daughter didn't love them. For 8 years, I had believed my parents didn't want me. And all of it, every moment of pain and loneliness and grief, had been manufactured by the person standing in front of us. The sister who was supposed to love me had erased me from my own family. And now, finally, everyone knew the truth. I could not stay in that room. The walls were closing in the air, too thick to breathe. I pushed back my chair and stood up, mumbling something about needing a moment, and walked out of the private dining room before anyone could stop me. The main restaurant passed in a blur. I found a side door that led to a small outdoor patio, empty now, in the cool evening air. I stepped outside and let the door close behind me, finally alone. And then the tears came. I leaned against the brick wall and let myself cry in a way I had not cried in years. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook my entire body. 8 years. 8 years of believing my parents had stopped loving me. 8 years of holidays spent alone telling myself it was better this way, that I did not need a family that did not want me. 8 years of building walls around my heart because the alternative was too painful to bear. And it was all a lie. Every assumption I had made about my family, every conclusion I had drawn about why they had abandoned me was based on something that never happened. They had not rejected me. They had been told I rejected them. I thought about all those nights when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of my apartment, wondering what I had done wrong. All those times I picked up my phone to call home and then put it down again, convinced they would not answer, convinced they did not want to hear from me. All those years of convincing myself that I was better off alone, that family was just another word for disappointment. They were believing the same things about me. While I was crying over a family that seemed to have forgotten me, they were mourning a daughter they thought had abandoned them. While I was telling myself they did not care, they were being told I did not care. We were on opposite sides of a wall that Dara had built, each of us hurting, each of us lonely, each of us believing the worst about the other. The realization did not feel like victory. It felt like being gutted. I had imagined this moment so many times over the years. The moment when my family would finally understand that I was not the cold, distant daughter they thought I was. I had thought it would feel triumphant. I had thought there would be vindication relief, some sense of justice being served. Instead, I just felt empty. The truth had come out, but the truth could not give me back those 8 years. It could not erase the loneliness, the doubt, the nights I spent wondering if I was fundamentally unlovable. It could not undo the damage that had been done to all of us. I heard the door open behind me and quickly wiped my face, trying to compose myself. But when I turned around, I saw my father standing there and all my defences crumbled again. He looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. His heart condition had taken a visible toll on him, and the events of tonight seemed to have aged him even further. He moved slowly, carefully, and when he reached the spot where I was standing, he leaned against the wall beside me, catching his breath. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The city sounds drifted around us, cars passing on the street, the distant murmur of conversations from inside, the ordinary noises of a world that had no idea what was happening in this small patio behind a restaurant. Finally, Dad broke the silence. His voice was quiet, hesitant, nothing like the confident father I remembered from childhood. "Why didn't you try harder to reach us?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I turned to look at him, searching his face for the accusation for blame, but all I saw was confusion and pain. "I did try, Dad." My voice cracked on the words. "I tried for years. I called and no one answered. I sent emails that went into silence. I sent cards for birthdays and holidays that were never acknowledged. Every time I reached out, it felt like shouting into a void." I had to stop to steady myself before continuing. "And every time there was no response, I thought it was because you didn't want me. I thought you had decided I wasn't worth the effort. I thought..." The tears started again and I could not stop them. "I thought you didn't want me as a daughter anymore." Dad's face crumpled. I watched this man who had always seemed so strong, so certain, fall apart in front of me. "And I thought you didn't need me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dara kept telling us how busy you were, how successful, how you had moved on to bigger and better things. She said you found our calls annoying. She said you asked her to tell us to stop reaching out." He turned to face me fully and I saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I thought you had grown too important for this family. I thought we embarrassed you. I thought..." He had to stop, overcome with emotion. "I thought my daughter had stopped loving me." We stood there, father and daughter, looking at each other through tears. Two people who had loved each other all along, separated by lies, finally seeing the truth. But the truth was not freeing. It was a crushing, I never stopped loving you, Dad, I said. Not for one single day. He reached out and pulled me into a hug. It was awkward, unpracticed. We had not embraced like this in years. But I held on to him and let myself cry against his shoulder, mourning all the time we had lost, all the moments we would never get back. I'm so sorry, he whispered into my hair. I'm so sorry I believed her. I should have known. I should have tried harder to reach you myself instead of just accepting what she told us. We both should have, I said. But she made sure we didn't. We stayed like that for a long time, holding on to each other in the cool night air, two broken people trying to find their way back to each other. Through the window, I could see into the restaurant. The family was still gathered around the table, but the atmosphere had changed completely. People were standing now surrounding Dara, their faces angry and demanding. My sister was cornered. Everywhere she turned, there was another relative, asking questions, demanding explanations. She looked like a trapped animal, her earlier confidence completely shattered. She was about to do what she always did, fight back with more lies, twist the narrative, find someone else to blame. Or maybe, finally, she would tell the truth. We found a bench at the edge of the patio, away from the windows, away from the chaos inside. Dad lowered himself onto it slowly, his breathing laboured from the short walk. His heart condition made everything harder now, and the emotional weight of the evening was clearly taking its toll. I sat beside him, and for a moment we just existed together in the quiet. The night air was cool against my tear-streaked face. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn sounded. Life continued all around us, indifferent to the family being torn apart inside that restaurant. Then I pulled out my phone. I want to show you something, I said quietly. I kept everything, Dad, every email I sent, every message, every record of every call I made that went to voicemail. I don't know why I saved them. Maybe I hoped someday someone would believe me. I opened the folder I had created years ago, the one I had added to obsessively during those early years of silence. I handed him the phone and watched his face as he began to scroll through the contents. The first email was dated 8 years ago. A simple message asking how everyone was doing, mentioning that I missed them, hoping we could talk soon. It had never been answered. The second was from a week later. Then another, and another. Dozens of emails spanning months, then years. Birthday wishes for Mum. Get well messages when I heard through cousins that Dad had the flu. Holiday greetings, updates about my life that I desperately wanted to share with the people who should have cared most. All of them unanswered. All of them turned into what I thought was deliberate silence. Dad's hands began to tremble as he scrolled. His face, already pale from the revelations inside, grew ashen. He stopped on one email dated 3 years ago. A long message I had written late one night after drinking too much wine and feeling desperately lonely. Dad, the email read, I don't know if you'll ever see this. I don't know if you even want to hear from me anymore. But I miss you. I miss Mum. I miss being part of a family. Whatever I did to make you stop loving me, I'm sorry. Please, just tell me what it was so I can try to fix it. Please. He made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. He could not read any more. He handed the phone back to me, unable to look at the evidence of years of desperate, unanswered reaching out. There's more, I said gently. I was not trying to hurt him. I just needed him to understand. I need to show you something else. I navigated to another folder. This one contained financial records, receipts, bank statements, documentation that I had kept meticulously over the years. 3 years ago, when you had your first heart scare, there was a hospital bill. A big one. Do you remember? Dad nodded slowly, his brow furrowing in confusion. The insurance didn't cover all of it, but the hospital said... They said there was a charitable fund. They said someone had paid the balance. There was no charitable fund, Dad. I called the billing department directly. I paid it myself to the institution, so it wouldn't count as a gift that could create tax problems for you. I asked them not to tell you where the money came from." His mouth opened, but no words came out. "And 5 years ago, when the roof needed repairs after that bad storm, Mum told Aunt Patricia that some community assistance program had covered the cost. That wasn't a community program. It was my company's charitable arm. I arranged for the funds to be allocated to your address specifically. I made it look like random assistance because I knew you would never accept money directly from me." Dad was shaking his head now, not in denial, but in disbelief. Pieces were falling into place that he had never thought to question. "The year before that, when Mum needed dental work and your insurance had lapsed, the dentist's office said they had received an anonymous donation to cover patients in need. That was me too, Dad. I called them and paid the bill before Mum even knew there was a balance." I could have continued. There were more examples, more instances of help sent from the shadows, because I believed my family would not accept anything from me directly. Years of financial support that I had disguised as charity, as luck, as the kindness of strangers. But Dad had heard enough. He broke down completely. This was not the quiet tears from earlier. This was a total collapse. His shoulders heaved with sobs. His whole body shook. He buried his face in his hands and wept like I had never seen him weep before. "All along," he choked out between sobs. "It was you, all along." I reached over and put my hand on his back, feeling his body shake beneath my palm. "I remember," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "I remember telling Dara how blessed we were, how lucky. I said, look at this. Strangers care more about us than our own daughter does. I said that Holly, I said those words." The pain in his voice was unbearable. "And the whole time, it was you. You were taking care of her. You never stopped taking care of us. And we treated you like you didn't matter, like you were nothing, like you had abandoned us." He finally looked up at me, his face ravaged by tears. This man who had always been so stoic, so reserved with his emotions. I had never seen him so raw, so completely undone. "How can you ever forgive us?" he asked. "How can you ever forgive me?" I did not have an answer. The truth was I did not know if I could. The hurt ran so deep, had been building for so long, that I could not simply wave it away because the truth had finally come out. Forgiveness would take time. Healing would take longer. But I knew one thing for certain. "I never stopped loving you, Dad," I said, "even when I thought you didn't love me anymore, even when I believed you had given up on me. I never stopped." He reached for me then, and this time the embrace was different from the awkward hug we had shared earlier. This was desperate, fierce. The grip of a man who realised he had almost lost his daughter to lies, who had almost faced his illness and possibly his death without ever knowing the truth about the child he had raised. I held on to him just as tightly. 8 years of distance, of loneliness, of believing I was unloved. 8 years of walls I had built around my heart to protect myself from the pain of rejection. All of it began to crack as my father held me and sobbed into my shoulder. We stayed like that for a long time. I do not know how long. The world outside our small circle faded away. There was only this moment, this broken but genuine connection between a father and daughter who had been kept apart by deception. When we finally pulled apart, both of our faces were wet with tears. Dad reached up and cupped my face in his weathered hands, looking at me with an intensity I had not seen since I was a little girl. "I'm going to make this right," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to make this right. You deserve so much better than what we gave you." Before I could respond, the door to the patio burst open. Mum stood there, her face streaked with tears, her carefully applied makeup ruined. She looked between us, taking in our emotional state, and her expression shifted to something approaching panic. "Richard, Holly, you both need to come inside. Now." Her voice was trembling badly. Something had happened while we were out here. "What's wrong?" Dad asked, struggling to his feet. Mum shook her head, unable to find the words. "It's Dara. She's saying things that don't make sense. She's talking about something that happened when she was 17, something she heard. The whole family is in there and she's falling apart and I don't know what to do." Dad and I exchanged a look. Whatever was happening inside, it was clear that the night was far from over. We followed Mum back into the restaurant, stepping from the cool quiet of the patio into whatever chaos awaited us. The scene inside the restaurant had transformed completely in the short time we had been on the patio. The celebratory dinner was over. The careful seating arrangements had dissolved into chaos. Extended family members stood in clusters throughout the private dining room, speaking in hushed, urgent voices. The wait staff had retreated to the edges of the room, unsure whether to clear plates or simply stay out of the way. And at the centre of it all sat Dara. She was alone at the table, the chairs around her conspicuously empty. Her red dress, so carefully chosen to command attention, now seemed garish against her pale, tear-streaked face. Her makeup was ruined, mascara running down her cheeks in dark rivers. Her hands shook as they gripped the edge of the tablecloth, knuckles white. Marcus stood several feet away near the wall. His arms were crossed over his chest, and he refused to meet anyone's eyes. The distance between him and his wife spoke volumes. He had known about Holly's success for a year and kept it secret, but even he seemed unwilling to stand beside Dara now that the full extent of her deception had been revealed. When we entered, the whispered conversation stopped. Every head turned toward us. I felt the weight of their attention, their curiosity, their shock at the revelations that had unfolded in our absence. Dad surveyed the room slowly. Despite his weakened heart, despite the emotional devastation of the past hour, something had shifted in him. He stood straighter than he had all evening. When he spoke, his voice was stronger than it had been in years. "I need to say something," he announced. "To all of you." The room fell completely silent. He walked toward the centre of the dining area, and I watched family members part to let him through. He stopped near the head of the table, where he would have been sitting if this had remained a birthday celebration, instead of becoming a tribunal. "I owe my daughter Holly a public apology," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "For years, I believed she had abandoned this family. I believed she was too busy, too successful, too important to bother with us. I was wrong." He paused, gathering himself. I could see how much effort this was taking, how much pain lay beneath every word. Holly never abandoned us. She reached out constantly. She called, she wrote, she sent messages for years. None of them reached us. She also supported this family financially in ways we never knew about. Hospital bills we thought were covered by charity. Home repairs we thought came from community programs. All of it came from Holly. She never stopped caring for us, even when we gave her every reason to believe we didn't care about her. He took a shaky breath. We were deliberately separated from our daughter, kept apart by lies and manipulation. For 8 years, my wife and I mourned a relationship we thought our daughter had chosen to end. And the whole time she was mourning the same thing, believing we had rejected her. He did not say Dara's name. He did not have to. Every person in that room knew exactly who had done this. Every pair of eyes drifted toward the woman sitting alone at the table, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Uncle Richard, the family patriarch, stepped forward. His face was set in hard lines, the expression of a man who had seen much in his 70-plus years, but was still capable of being shocked by cruelty within his own family. "I always wondered why Holly never came to holidays," he said slowly. "I asked about it once, years ago. I asked Dara directly why her sister was never around." He turned to look at Dara, and the disappointment in his eyes was devastating. "You told me Holly thought she was too good for us now. You said she looked down on the family, that she had moved on to bigger and better things and didn't want to be associated with the small-town relatives. I believed you. We all believed you." He shook his head, his voice heavy with betrayal. You lied to all of us, Dara. Not just your parents. All of us. Every member of this family was manipulated into believing something false about Holly. Every conversation we had about her absence, every assumption we made about her character was based on stories you told us. Aunt Patricia spoke up from across the room. I said terrible things about Holly at Thanksgiving 2 years ago. I called her ungrateful. I said she didn't deserve parents as good as Richard and Eleanor. Her voice cracked. And the whole time she was trying to reach us. She was taking care of her parents from the shadows while we sat around talking about how selfish she was. One by one, family members began to share similar stories. Cousins who had dismissed Holly as stuck-up. Uncles who had made jokes about her thinking she was better than everyone. Aunts who had clucked their tongues about children who abandoned their parents. All of it based on Dara's lies. I watched my sister shrink under the weight of their words. Each revelation, each admission of how thoroughly she had poisoned the family's perception of me seemed to push her further into herself. She had nowhere to hide, no one to defend her. The narrative she had constructed so carefully over 15 years was crumbling around her in real time. The social reckoning was brutal in its quietness. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontations, just one family member after another turning away from Dara, unable to meet her eyes. The expressions on their faces were not hatred. They were something worse. Disappointment, pity, and the dawning recognition that they could never fully trust anything Dara had ever told them about anyone. If she had lied about her own sister for years, what else had she lied about? What other relationships had she manipulated? What other narratives had she twisted to serve her own needs? The questions hung, unspoken, in the air, but everyone was clearly thinking them. Marcus finally moved. He walked to the table, but not to comfort his wife. He picked up his jacket from the back of a chair and shrugged it on his movements, deliberate and final. I told you last year, he said quietly, barely loud enough for anyone but Dara to hear. I told you to come clean. I told you this would all fall apart eventually. Dara looked up at him with desperate eyes. Marcus, please. I can't do this right now, he said, and walked out of the room without looking back. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any shout. In the silence that followed, Mum stepped forward. She had been standing near the entrance since we came back inside, watching everything unfold, with tears streaming down her face. Now she moved toward Dara, her steps slow and uncertain. The room held its breath. Everyone watched, waiting to see what she would do. This was Dara's mother, the woman who had enabled her favoritism for years, who had always defended her younger daughter, who had dismissed Holly's concerns as sensitivity and overreaction. Would she comfort Dara now? Would she find some way to defend her, to minimize what she had done? Mum stopped in front of Dara's chair. She looked down at her younger daughter, this woman she had raised and loved and apparently never truly known. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the room, everyone heard. How could you do this to your sister? Dara looked up, her face a mask of anguish. Mum, I can explain. How could you do this to us, to your father and me? We lost 8 years with our daughter because of you. 8 years of thinking she didn't love us. 8 years of missing her and believing she didn't miss us back. Mum's voice grew stronger, fueled by a grief that was rapidly transforming into anger. We are not young anymore, Dara. Your father has a heart condition. We don't know how much time we have left. And you stole years from us. Years we can never get back. Dara looked up at Mum with eyes that held years of desperation. Her mascara had smeared into dark circles, making her look haunted, almost unrecognisable from the polished woman who had walked into this restaurant just hours ago. I did it for this family, she said, her voice cracking. You don't understand. If Holly came back, really came back, she would take everything. She would become the favourite again. You would forget about me completely, just like before. Mum stared at her confusion mixing with the anger on her face. What are you talking about? Forget about you, Dara. We've never forgotten about you. We've always been here for you. That's because Holly was gone. Dara's voice rose to something close to a shriek. That's the only reason you paid attention to me, because she wasn't here to overshadow me. If she came back with all her success and all her money and all her important clients, you would realize how much better she is than me. You would see that I was never enough. The words hung in the air, the desperate logic of a frightened child spoken through the mouth of a 32-year-old woman. It made no sense and perfect sense at the same time. Mum shook her head slowly. Dara, why would you ever think that? Why would you believe we would forget about you just because your sister was around? And then it poured out. Dara's face crumpled, and for a moment I saw the teenager she had been wounded and insecure before she rebuilt herself into someone capable of systematic cruelty. Because I heard you, she whispered, 15 years ago. I was standing outside your bedroom door. I was going to ask about borrowing the car, and I heard you talking about us, about me and Holly. Dad's face went pale. Mum's hand flew to her mouth. You said Holly was going to do great things. You said you didn't need to worry about her because she was so smart, so capable. And then you talked about me. Dara's voice broke completely. You said I was lacking. You said I didn't have Holly's mind. You said you needed to make up for what I didn't have. The room was utterly silent. Every relative stood frozen watching this confession unfold. You made me feel like I wasn't enough. Dara continued, tears streaming freely now. Like I was the defective daughter, the one you had to compensate for because I could never measure up on my own. So I decided that if I couldn't be better than Holly, I would make her smaller. I would make sure you never had the chance to compare us because she wouldn't be around to compare to. Mum and Dad exchanged a look. I saw recognition in their eyes. They remembered that conversation. They remembered saying those words. They had not known Dara was listening. They had not meant for their private concerns to reach their younger daughter's ears. But meaning doesn't matter. Impact matters. Dara? Mum started, her voice filled with anguish. We didn't mean it like that. We were just worried about you. We knew Holly would be fine on her own, and we wanted to make sure you had the support you needed. It wasn't about you being less than her. That's not what you said, Dara shot back. You said I was lacking. You said I needed help because I wasn't as smart. Do you have any idea what that does to a 17-year-old to hear your own parents say, you're not as good as your sister? For a moment, I felt something unexpected. Sympathy, not forgiveness, not absolution, but a genuine pang of understanding for the wounded teenager Dara had been. I could imagine her standing outside that door, hearing words that reshaped how she saw herself and her place in our family. I saw the same sympathy flicker across other faces in the room. Aunt Patricia's eyes softened slightly. Uncle Richard's rigid posture relaxed just a fraction. Even the cousins, who had been looking at Dara with pure disgust, seemed to pause, reconsidering. But then I remembered. She didn't just act out once. She didn't just have a bad reaction to a painful moment and then move on. She spent 15 years systematically destroying my relationship with our parents. She intercepted messages for 8 years. She told lies at every family gathering. She watched me struggle to connect with a family that had been turned against me, and she said nothing. A wound doesn't justify becoming the person who wounds others. The sympathy faded from the faces around me as the humbling realization settled over the room. Whatever pain Dara had experienced as a teenager, it did not excuse what she had done as an adult. It did not justify the calculated, ongoing deception that had cost all of us so much. Dad spoke, his voice rough. Dara, if you had come to us back then, told us what you heard, we could have talked about it. We could have explained. We could have made sure you knew how much we loved you, how proud we were of you. Instead, you chose to hurt your sister, Mum added quietly, For 15 years, you chose to take something from all of us that we can never get back. Dara had no response. She sat there broken and exposed, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. I had been silent since we came back inside, watching, listening, trying to process everything that was being revealed. But there was one more thing I needed to know. One more piece of the puzzle that had been nagging at me since the night began. I stepped forward, and the room's attention shifted to me. I didn't know about that night, Dara. I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. I didn't know what you heard. I didn't know you had been carrying that pain all these years. And I'm sorry that Mum and Dad's words hurt you so deeply. Dara looked up at me with a flicker of hope in her eyes. Hope that I might understand. Hope that I might forgive. But I wasn't finished. But I need to know one more thing, I continued. And I need you to tell me the truth. The hope in her eyes began to fade, replaced by wariness. When did you find out that I saved your company from bankruptcy last year? The room went still again. This was something new, something the extended family had not heard about yet. Dara's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise that I knew, fear of what I might reveal, and finally, the resigned look of someone who knows they've been caught. How did you... she started. I saw my name in the contracts, I said. My firm handled the restructuring. I made sure the paperwork kept me anonymous, but there was no means to completely hide my involvement from anyone who looked closely enough. So, I'll ask you again, Dara. When did you find out? The question hung in the air between us. I watched Dara's face cycle through a storm of emotions. Anger flashed first, the instinctive defensiveness of someone who has been caught. Then fear, the realization that she was cornered with no escape. And finally, shame, deep and crushing as the weight of what she had done settled fully onto her shoulders. She could lie. I saw her consider it. Her eyes darted around the room, calculating whether there was any way to spin this, any story she could tell that would make her look less terrible. But everyone was watching. The extended family, our parents, the staff who had lingered near the edges of the room. All of them waited for her answer, and somehow, after everything that had already been exposed tonight, Dara seemed too exhausted to maintain the performance any longer. Her shoulders slumped. The fight went out of her. 6 months ago, she said quietly, I saw the contract. Your name was right there in the documentation. I knew you saved us. A collective gasp rippled through the room. This was worse than what they had already heard. This meant that Dara had known about my help and had continued her cruelty anyway. I nodded slowly as if confirming something I had suspected but needed to hear out loud. 6 months ago. So you knew at Thanksgiving when you made jokes about my failing business. You knew at Christmas when you told everyone on the video call that I probably couldn't afford to buy gifts. You knew last week at this restaurant when you asked if I could even afford to eat here. Dara flinched at each example, but she did not deny any of them. You knew I had saved your company, saved your employees' jobs, saved everything you and Marcus had built together. And you still stood in front of our family and called me a failure. Yes, she whispered. The single word seemed to drain whatever energy she had left. Mum made a sound of pure anguish. Dad looked like he might be sick. The cousins exchanged horrified glances. Even Aunt Patricia, who had always had a soft spot for Dara, turned away in disgust. Why? I asked. It was the only question that mattered now. If you knew what I did for you, why did you keep trying to hurt me? Dara was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to barely a whisper, so quiet that everyone in the room had to lean in to hear. Because I hated you more after I found out. The words made no sense, and perfect sense at the same time. I hated you because I owed you. Because you helped me without expecting anything back. Because even after everything I did to you, all the lies I told, all the ways I tried to make you small, you still saved my company. You still protected my family's livelihood. Her voice cracked. You were better than me. Even when I was cruel, you were kind, and I couldn't stand it. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she made no move to wipe them away. I wanted you to be the villain, she continued. I needed you to be selfish and cold and everything I told everyone you were, because if you were bad, then I wasn't the worst one. If you were the terrible sister who abandoned her family, then what I did wasn't so awful by comparison. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. But you weren't bad. You were never bad. You were just living your life trying to reach a family that had been turned against you. And I was the one poisoning everything. I was the villain the whole time. The confession hung in the air, raw and devastating. This was not the defiant Dara who had stood up and shouted accusations just an hour ago. This was someone stripped of all her defences, finally facing the truth of who she had become. Uncle Richard spoke into the silence. His voice was quiet, not angry anymore, just tired and sad. Dara, you need help. Professional help. This isn't... He paused, searching for the right words. This isn't normal. The way you've been thinking, the things you've done. You've been destroying yourself while trying to destroy your sister. It was not an attack. It was not cruelty. It was simply the truth that everyone in the room could see. Dara's hatred had consumed her, twisted her into someone unrecognizable. Whatever wound had started this 15 years ago had festered into something that required more than family forgiveness to heal. Dara nodded slowly, accepting the assessment. She had no fight left. I looked at my sister, this woman I had grown up with, played with as a child, shared a home with for 18 years. I thought about all the pain she had caused me, all the years I had lost, all the nights I had cried believing my family did not love me. And I thought about the wounded 17-year-old standing outside her parents' bedroom, hearing words that made her feel like she would never be enough. I walked toward her. The room tensed. I could feel everyone watching, wondering what I would do. This was the moment for righteous anger, for a devastating verbal blow, for the final condemnation that Dara so clearly deserved. I stopped in front of her chair and looked down at my sister, and then I said something no one expected. I forgive you. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Dara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mum gasped. Dad stared at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. Not for your sake, I continued quietly. For mine. I've spent 8 years carrying anger and hurt and confusion about why my family abandoned me. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life carrying hatred too. I crouched down so I was at eye level with her. What you did was wrong. It was cruel and calculated, and it cost all of us more than you'll ever be able to repay. But holding on to rage won't give me back those years. It will only poison whatever future I have left. Dara's face crumpled. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I don't understand, she whispered. How can you forgive me after everything? Because I refuse to let what you did turn me into someone bitter and vengeful. Because I want to be free of this, even if you never are. I stood up and took a step back. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. We have a long road ahead, Dara, and I honestly don't know if we'll ever get to the end of it. The room began to shift around us. The confrontation was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. I stepped back from Dara and turned to face the rest of the family. They were watching me with a mixture of awe and confusion, clearly unsure what to make of my decision to forgive. Some looked relieved that there would be no more shouting. Others seemed almost disappointed, as if they had been waiting for a more dramatic conclusion. But I had no interest in drama. I had no desire for revenge. What would be the point? Screaming at Dara would not give me back the years I had lost. Humiliating her further would not heal the wounds that had been inflicted on all of us. I looked at my sister, still sitting in that chair, and I spoke the truth as simply as I could. I'm not going to destroy you, Dara. You've already done that to yourself. The words landed with more impact than any insult could have. I watched Dara flinch, watched the realization settle into her eyes. She had braced herself for attack, for anger, for a fight she could lose herself in. Instead, she got something far worse. She got pity. And somehow, that was the cruelest blow of all. The family began gathering their things. Aunt Patricia picked up her purse and her husband's jacket. Uncle Richard said something quiet to his wife, and they moved toward the door without looking back at Dara. The cousins, who had once envied my sister's seemingly perfect life, now avoided her gaze entirely, unable or unwilling to offer even a polite goodbye. I watched Dara's social world collapse in real time. These were people who had adored her for years, who had believed every word she said, who had accepted her version of events without question. Now, they saw the truth. Now, they understood that the woman they thought they knew was a fabrication, a character she had created to hide the insecure, manipulative person beneath. Her credibility was gone. Every story she had ever told them would be questioned now. Every opinion she had shared about anyone would be filtered through the knowledge that she was capable of sustained, calculated deception. The trust she had built over 15 years had evaporated in a single evening. One by one, family members filed out of the private dining room. A few nodded to me as they passed, their expression sympathetic. Others squeezed my arm or touched my shoulder, small gestures of support that I accepted with quiet gratitude. None of them said goodbye to Dara. When most of the family had gone, Marcus reappeared. I had almost forgotten about him in the chaos of the confrontation. He had left earlier, walking out when the revelations became too much, and I had assumed he was gone for the night. But here he was, standing in the doorway, his face drawn and tired. He walked slowly toward Dara, and for a moment I thought he might comfort her. They had been married for 5 years. Whatever her flaws, she was still his wife. But when he reached her, his expression was not tender. It was exhausted, defeated. "I told you," he said quietly. "Last year, when I found out about Holly, I told you to come clean. I begged you to tell the truth before it came out some other way." Dara looked up at him with desperate eyes. "Marcus, please. I know I made mistakes, but we can work through this. We can get counselling. I can't do this anymore," he interrupted, his voice breaking slightly. "I can't be married to someone I don't recognise. The woman I fell in love with wouldn't have done these things. The woman I married wouldn't have spent years destroying her own sister." "I'm still me," Dara pleaded. "I'm still the same person." "No," Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't think you are. Or maybe this is who you've always been, and I just couldn't see it." He took off his wedding ring. The simple gold band glinted in the restaurant's soft lighting as he set it on the table in front of her. "I'll have my lawyer contact you," he said. "I'm sorry, Dara, I really am." And then he walked out. Not dramatically, not with a slammed door or a final cutting remark. He just left quietly, like a man who had run out of things to say. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Dara stared at the ring on the table. Her marriage, her carefully constructed life, everything she had built on the foundation of her lies. Gone in a single evening. Mum and Dad lingered near the entrance, unsure what to do. They looked at their younger daughter, then at me, then at each other. The conflict on their faces was clear. This was still their child, still the daughter they had raised and loved. But she had done something unforgivable, and they did not know how to reconcile those two truths. "We should go," Dad finally said, his voice heavy. "Eleanor, we should let the staff clean up." Mum nodded, but she could not bring herself to leave without one last look at Dara. "We'll talk tomorrow," she said softly, "when everyone has had time to think." They left together, Dad's arm around Mum's shoulders. both of them looking decades older than they had at the start of the evening. The restaurant grew quiet. The waitstaff moved efficiently around the room, clearing plates and glasses, resetting tables for tomorrow's service. They worked around Dara as if she were part of the furniture, just another object to navigate around while doing their jobs. She sat there alone, staring at nothing. Hours ago, she had walked into this restaurant as the star of the family, the beloved daughter, the successful sister, the woman everyone envied and admired. Now she was surrounded by the wreckage of everything she had built. Her marriage was over. Her family's trust was shattered. Her social standing had collapsed, and the narrative she had spent 15 years constructing had been exposed as a lie. I had left with my parents, but something made me turn back. I told them I would meet them at the house, that there was one more thing I needed to do. I walked back into the restaurant and found Dara exactly where I had left her. She did not look up when I approached. She did not react when I pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the staff cleaning faded into the background. It was just the two of us sisters who had been strangers for far too long. Finally, I broke the silence. "We need to talk," I said. "Just us, sister to sister." Dara finally looked up at me. Her face was a ruin of smeared makeup and dried tears. The confident, polished woman who had greeted guests at the start of the evening was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Someone raw and broken, and for perhaps the first time in our adult lives completely without pretense. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "Because we've never actually talked," I said. "Not really, not honestly, and if there's any chance of moving forward from this, we need to start somewhere." She nodded slowly, accepting this. The fight had gone out of her completely. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table between us. "I'm not going to pretend tonight didn't happen. I'm not going to hug you and tell you everything is okay, because it's not. 8 years, Dara. You stole 8 years of my life with my parents. You made them believe I abandoned them. You made me believe they didn't want me. You can't just apologize that away." "I know," she whispered. "Do you? Because I don't think you understand what you took from me. I missed Dad's 60th birthday. I missed Mum's retirement party. I missed holidays and family dinners and ordinary Tuesday phone calls. I missed being a daughter to my own parents because you decided that I didn't deserve to have a relationship with them." Dara flinched at each example, but she did not try to defend herself. She did not make excuses or deflect or do any of the things I had expected. "I miss those things too," she said quietly. "I mean, I was there physically, but I missed having a sister. I spent so much energy keeping you away that I never actually knew you. I don't even know who you really are, Holly. I've been so busy competing with a version of you that I created in my head that I never bothered to learn about the real person." It was the first honest thing she had said in 15 years. "The real person," I repeated slowly. "You want to know who the real person is. The real person is someone who built a career from nothing. Someone who worked 80-hour weeks to prove she was worth something. Someone who helped families keep their homes and employees keep their jobs. And also someone who cried herself to sleep more nights than she can count, wondering why her family stopped loving her." Dara closed her eyes, absorbing the weight of my words. "The real person," I continued, "is someone who never stopped caring about you, even when she thought you didn't care about her. I saved your company, Dara. When I found out you were in trouble, I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about all the cruel things you'd said about me. I just helped because that's who I am." "I know," she said again, "and I hated you for it." "You told me that already, but I don't think I explained it well enough." She opened her eyes and looked at me directly. "I hated you because your kindness made my cruelty inexcusable. As long as I could tell myself you were cold and selfish, I could justify what I was doing. but you weren't cold or selfish. You were kind and generous, even to someone who had spent years trying to destroy you. And that meant I was the only villain in this story. There was no one else to blame. We sat in silence for a moment, letting her words settle between us. I said I forgave you earlier, I said finally, and I meant it, but I need you to understand what forgiveness means to me. It doesn't mean I'm okay with what you did. It doesn't mean we go back to being sisters like nothing happened. It means I'm choosing not to let hatred consume me. I'm choosing not to spend the rest of my life angry at you. Dara nodded, her eyes filling with fresh tears. But forgiveness isn't something I can fully give you tonight, I continued. Maybe not for a long time. The hurt is too deep, the damage too extensive. What I can tell you is that I'm not going to spend my energy hating you. That would mean you still have power over me, that you're still controlling my emotions and my choices, and I'm taking that power back. I understand, she said softly. I don't think you do yet, but maybe someday you will. I stood up from the table looking down at my sister. If you actually get help, real professional help, and if you actually change, not just perform change for an audience, then maybe someday we can have a relationship. Maybe someday we can be sisters who actually know each other. I paused, making sure she was listening. But I'm not waiting for you. I'm not putting my life on hold hoping you'll become a better person. That's your job, not mine. I'm going to rebuild my relationship with Mum and Dad. I'm going to live my life and build my career and find happiness. And whether you're part of that future is entirely up to you and the choices you make from here. Dara looked at me with something I had never seen in her eyes before. Not envy or resentment or the cold calculation of someone planning their next move. It was something simpler and more painful. It was respect. How do you do it? She asked. How are you this strong after everything? I considered the question. I'm not strong. I'm just tired of being invisible. Tired of letting other people's opinions define me. Tired of shrinking myself to make others comfortable. I picked up my purse from the chair. I spent years thinking there was something wrong with me because my family didn't love me. Now I know the truth. And the truth, as painful as it is also freeing. I turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing, I said without turning around. Get help, Dara. Real help. Not for me, not for Mom and Dad, not even for Marcus if there's any chance of saving your marriage. Do it for yourself, because the person you've been for the last 15 years isn't who you have to be forever. I started walking toward the exit. Holly. I paused, but did not turn around. For what it's worth, Dara said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm glad someone finally saw you, even if I couldn't. I stood there for a moment, letting her words wash over me. Part of me wanted to respond, to acknowledge the first genuine thing my sister had said to me in over a decade. But another part of me knew that this moment was not about reconciliation. It was about closure. I walked out of the restaurant without looking back. The night air was cool and clean, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. I stood on the sidewalk and took a deep breath, filling my lungs, feeling the tension slowly drain from my shoulders. For the first time in 8 years, I was visible. My family knew who I was. The lies had been exposed. The truth was finally out, and I was free. I slept poorly that night. My childhood bedroom felt smaller than I remembered, the ceiling close to the walls, pressing in. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of my family as the truth unfolded. Dara's desperation, Mum's anguish, Dad's tears. When morning finally came, grey light filtering through the curtains, I had picked out as a teenager, I lay in bed and stared at that familiar water stain on the ceiling. I was exhausted, in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. The emotional weight of the previous night had drained something fundamental from me. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Holly, are you awake? It was Mum's voice, hesitant and uncertain. "Yes," I said. "Come in." The door opened slowly, and both of my parents stepped into the room. They looked terrible. Dark circles under their eyes, faces drawn and pale. It was clear that neither of them had slept at all. Dad moved carefully, one hand pressed against his chest in that unconscious gesture he had developed since his diagnosis. The stress of last night could not have been good for his heart, but here he was anyway, standing in my doorway at 7 a.m. because some things were more important than rest. I sat up in bed, pulling the covers around myself. For a moment, none of us knew what to say. We just looked at each other, three people, trying to figure out how to be a family again after so many years of lies and distance. Mum spoke first. Her voice was rough, like she had been crying for hours, which she probably had. "I've been thinking all night," she said, "about the things we said, the things we believed. I blamed you for being distant, Holly. I told myself you had chosen your career over your family. I told myself you didn't care about us anymore." She had to stop, her voice cracking under the weight of what she needed to say. "But I never once questioned why. I never picked up the phone and called you myself to ask what was happening. I just accepted what Dara told us, because it was easier than confronting the possibility that something was wrong." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I was your mother. I should have known. I should have asked. I should have fought harder to keep you in our lives." I did not know what to say. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was not her fault, that Dara had manipulated all of us. But another part of me recognized that she was right. She was my mother. She should have questioned the narrative. She should have tried harder. "I'm not saying this to make excuses." Mum continued, reading the conflict on my face. "There are no excuses for what happened. I just want you to know that I understand now. I understand how badly we failed you." Dad stepped forward. He looked older than I had ever seen him, the events of the past 24 hours having aged him visibly. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but steady. "We can't undo what happened. We can't give you back those 8 years. But Holly, I want to know you. The real you. Not the story Dara told us, not the assumptions we made. I want to know my daughter." He reached out and took my hand. His grip was tentative, uncertain, like he was not sure he had the right to touch me anymore, like he was asking permission with every fibre of his being. "Will you give us the chance," he asked, "to start over, to learn who you really are?" I looked at my parents, these people who had raised me, who had loved me in their own flawed way, who had been deceived into believing I had abandoned them. I thought about all the pain of the past 8 years, all the loneliness, all the nights I had cried myself to sleep wondering what I had done wrong. And I thought about the future, about the possibility of having a real relationship with them, about weekly phone calls and holiday visits and all the ordinary moments that make up a family. I said finally, "I want to try, but it's going to take time. I can't just pretend the hurt doesn't exist. I can't go back to family dinners where I'm invisible and everyone acts like that's normal. I can't smile and nod while people make assumptions about my life that aren't true." Mum nodded, wiping her eyes. "We understand." "I need things to be different," I continued. "I need you to actually listen when I talk. I need you to ask questions about my life and care about the answers. I need to feel like I matter in this family, not like an afterthought." "You do matter," Dad said, his voice breaking slightly. "You always mattered. We just couldn't see it. We let someone else define who you were to us." I took a deep breath. "Here's what I can offer. Weekly calls, real conversations, not just checking a box. If something feels wrong, I'll tell you instead of pulling away. And you have to do the same. If you're confused or hurt or don't understand something, you ask me directly. No more relying on second-hand information." "That's fair," Mum said quickly. "That's more than fair. And I need you to understand that rebuilding trust takes time. There will be moments when I pull back, when the old hurt surfaces, and I need space. That doesn't mean I'm abandoning you again. It means I'm processing. Can you accept that? Both of them nodded. Dad squeezed my hand and I saw tears gathering in his eyes again. I'm sorry I almost ran out of time to know my own daughter. The words hit me harder than I expected. His heart condition, the diagnosis that had brought me home in the first place. We were not just talking about emotional reconciliation. We were talking about urgency, about the very real possibility that we might not have as many years left as we would like. We have time now, I said, trying to believe it. Let's not waste it. Mum moved forward and sat on the edge of my bed. Slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, she reached out and hugged me. It was awkward at first, stiff with years of distance, but then something shifted and I found myself hugging her back. Dad joined us, wrapping his arms around both of us, and for the first time in 8 years, I felt like I had a family again. It was not perfect, it was not healed, but it was a beginning. 3 months passed. Not quickly, not easily, but they passed. I was back in my city, back in my corner office on the 30th floor, back to the rhythm of client meetings and restructuring plans and the work that had defined my life for so long. But something was different now. The weight I had carried for 8 years, that constant heaviness in my chest, had begun to lift. Every Sunday evening, I video called my parents. We had settled into this routine in the weeks after that devastating dinner, and somehow it had stuck. The calls were not always comfortable. Sometimes we struggled to fill the silence, unsure what to say to each other after so many years of distance. Sometimes we stumbled over references to events I had missed or inside jokes I did not understand. But the calls were real. That was what mattered. Last Sunday, Dad had spent 20 minutes updating me on his heart treatment. The specialist I was paying for had adjusted his medication, and he was feeling stronger than he had in months. This time, there was no pretense about where the money came from, no fictional charity or community assistance program. Your mother and I talked about it, he had said, looking slightly embarrassed but determined. We're not going to hide from the truth anymore. You're helping us, and we're grateful. That's all there is to it. It was such a small thing, really, just an acknowledgement of reality. But after years of my help being invisible, of my love being translated into anonymous donations, hearing my father simply say thank you meant more than I could express. Mum had started sending me emails. Not long ones, nothing elaborate, just little notes with recipes attached. You used to love this when you were little, she wrote last week, attaching instructions for her chicken casserole. I remember you asking for seconds every time. I had made the recipe that weekend. It was not quite as good as I remembered, probably because Mum's cooking always had some secret ingredient she forgot to write down. But I took a photo of my attempt and sent it back to her, and she responded with a string of exclamation points and a promise to teach me the right way to make it next time I visited. These small exchanges were not dramatic. They would not make for interesting stories at dinner parties. But they were building something brick by brick that had been demolished years ago. A foundation, a connection, a tentative trust that maybe with enough time and effort could become something solid. Dara was in therapy now. I had heard this from Mum during one of our calls, delivered carefully, as if she was unsure whether I wanted to know about my sister at all. Apparently, it was a condition Marcus had set for reconsidering their separation. Weekly sessions with a licensed therapist, genuine engagement with the process, demonstrable change over time. I did not know if Marcus would take her back. I did not know if Dara was capable of the transformation she needed. Those were questions I could not answer and had decided not to spend my energy worrying about. What I did know was that Dara had sent me a letter. It arrived 2 weeks ago, a plain white envelope with my sister's handwriting on the front. I had stared at it for a long time, turning it over in my hands, trying to decide what to do. In the end, I had put it in my desk drawer, unopened. I was not ready. The wounds were still too fresh, the trust too fragile. Maybe someday I would read what she had to say. Maybe someday I would be able to hear her words without the old anger rising up to choke me, but not yet, and that was allowed. The most significant change was internal. For the first time in nearly a decade, I did not dread the thought of home. When Mum mentioned upcoming holidays or suggested I visit for a weekend, I did not feel that familiar pit in my stomach. The anxiety that had always accompanied any thought of my family had begun to fade. The pain was not gone. I did not think it would ever disappear completely. Some scars are too deep to vanish entirely, but the pain was no longer the only thing I felt when I thought about my parents. Now there was also hope, possibility, the tentative belief that we might actually build something new from the wreckage of what Dara had destroyed. I was sitting in my office late on a Thursday afternoon reviewing contracts for an upcoming deal when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and felt a small jolt of surprise. It was Robert Chen, the managing partner of my firm. He rarely called directly. Most of our communication went through assistants and scheduled meetings. "Robert," I said, picking up, "what can I do for you?" "Holly." His voice was warm but businesslike. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just contract review. Nothing that can't wait." Good. He paused and I could hear something in the silence. Anticipation, maybe. Or excitement carefully restrained. "Holly, the board met last night. We've been discussing the firm's future direction, succession planning, that sort of thing." I sat up straighter in my chair, suddenly alert. "There's something we'd like to offer you," Robert continued. "Something we think you've more than earned. Can you come by my office tomorrow morning, say 9 o'clock? "Of course," I said, my heart beginning to beat faster. "I'll be there." "Excellent. I think you're going to like what we have to say." He hung up and I sat in the quiet of my office, staring out at the city skyline that had been my view for years. Something was changing. Something big. The next morning, I sat across from Robert Chen in his corner office, the one with the view that was even better than mine. He smiled as he slid a folder across the desk. "The board's decision was unanimous," he said. "We want you to become senior partner Holly. You've earned it. The Williams restructuring alone would have been enough to justify the promotion, but your entire body of work over the past decade speaks for itself." I opened the folder and looked at the documents inside. The title, the compensation package, the responsibilities. Everything I had worked toward for years laid out in black and white. "We want to make it official," Robert continued. "A ceremony, an announcement, the whole thing. You deserve to be recognized publicly for what you've accomplished. We're thinking, next month, give us time to organize something appropriately impressive." I should have felt triumphant. This was the culmination of everything I had sacrificed for every late night and missed weekend and relationship put on hold. Senior partner at 35. It was remarkable by any standard. But as I looked at those documents, I found myself thinking not about my career, but about my parents, about all the years they had believed I was a failure, about the fact that they had never seen me in my element, never witnessed the respect I commanded in my professional world, never understood who their daughter had become. "I accept," I said, "but I have one request." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Name it." "I want my parents to be there, at the ceremony." He looked slightly surprised, but nodded easily. "Of course. Family is important. We'll make sure they have seats in the front row." That evening, I called home and told my parents about the promotion. Mum cried. Dad asked me to explain what senior partner meant, and I spent 20 minutes walking him through the structure of the firm and why this position mattered. At the end of my explanation, he was quiet for a long moment. "We'll be there," he said finally. "Both of us." "Dad, your heart. The doctor said you shouldn't be travelling." "I don't care what the doctor said. My daughter is being honoured for her work, and I'm going to be in that room. This is not negotiable, Holly." I wanted to argue, but I heard something in his voice that stopped me. Determination, pride, and maybe a little bit of desperation, the awareness that time was precious and he had already missed too much. "Okay," I said. "I'll arrange your flights." The ceremony was held in the grand ballroom of a downtown hotel, the kind of space usually reserved for galas and corporate events. I stood backstage, peeking through the curtains at the crowd that had gathered. Industry leaders, clients past and present, colleagues who had worked alongside me for years, and in the front row, looking slightly overwhelmed, but resolutely present, my parents. Dad was wearing a suit I had never seen before. Later, Mum would tell me he had bought it specially for the occasion, insisting on something new, because he wanted to look his best for his daughter's big moment. Mum was in a blue dress, her good pearls around her neck, clutching her purse in her lap like a lifeline. They looked completely out of place among the polished executives and business leaders. And they looked exactly right. The ceremony began with Robert giving a speech about the firm's history and values. Then came the testimonials. One by one, people I had worked with over the years took the stage to share their experiences. Thomas Williams spoke about how I had saved his family's company, how 150 employees still had jobs because of my work. A woman named Sarah Chen, whose small business I had helped restructure 3 years ago, talked about how I had treated her with respect and patience when larger firms had dismissed her as too small to matter. A colleague named David described the time I had stayed at the office until midnight to help him prepare for a crucial presentation, even though I had nothing to gain from his success. I watched my parents as these stories unfolded. Dad's eyes grew wider with each testimonial. Mum dabbed at her face with a tissue she had pulled from her purse. They were really seeing me for the first time. Not the cold daughter who abandoned her family, not the failure who could barely afford to eat at nice restaurants, but the woman I had actually become. The professional who commanded respect, the colleague who lifted others up, the person who had built something meaningful through years of quiet, dedicated excellence. When it was my turn to take the stage and accept the promotion, I looked out at the crowd and found my parents' faces. Dad was crying openly now, making no effort to hide his tears. Mum was gripping his hand so tightly, her knuckles had turned white. I gave a short speech thanking the people who had supported me along the way. I talked about the importance of integrity, of treating every client as if their problem was the most important in the world of building trust through consistent action rather than empty promises. And then, because I could not help myself, I looked directly at my parents and added one more thing. I also want to thank my family for being here tonight. It means more than I can say to have you witness this moment. Afterward, during the reception, Dad found me in the crowd. He had to push through a cluster of well-wishers to reach me, and by the time he did, his face was flushed and he was breathing a little hard. "Dad, you should sit down," I said, concerned about his heart. He waved off my worry. "I'm fine. I just needed to tell you something." He took both of my hands in his and I saw that his eyes were red from crying. "I didn't know," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "All those years I didn't know this is who you were. I believed the stories. I believed you had chosen your career over us, that you thought you were too good for your family. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Dad, let me finish." He squeezed my hands tightly. "I'm proud of you, Holly. I should have said that a long time ago. I should have seen you for who you really are instead of believing lies about who you weren't. I'm sorry it took me so long. And I'm proud. So incredibly proud." It was not enough to erase the past. No words could do that. But standing there in that ballroom, holding my father's hands while he cried and told me he was proud of me, I felt something shift inside my chest. A door that had been closed for years cracked open just a little bit more. "Thank you, Dad," I said. "That means everything." The flight home was quiet. I sat in first class, a luxury I had earned but rarely indulged in, watching the clouds drift past the window. The ceremony was over. The promotion was official. My parents had finally seen the truth of who I was. I should have felt complete. But something was nagging at me, something I had been avoiding for weeks. I reached into my bag to pull out a book I had brought for the flight, and my fingers brushed against paper. An envelope. I pulled it out and looked at it. Dara's letter, the one I had tucked away unopened. I must have transferred it to this bag without thinking, or maybe some part of me had put it there deliberately, knowing this moment would come. I held the envelope in my hands for a long time. The plane hummed around me. Flight attendants moved quietly through the cabin. Outside, the world was nothing but sky and clouds. Finally, I slid my finger under the seal and opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on plain white paper. Dara's handwriting had always been neater than mine, precise and controlled, but these pages looked different. The letters were uneven in places, as if her hand had trembled while writing. There were spots where the ink had smeared, maybe from tears, maybe from the effort of putting these words on paper. I began to read. Dear Holly, I've started this letter a dozen times. My therapist says I need to write it whether I send it or not, that the act of putting my thoughts into words is part of the process. But I want you to know that I'm not writing this because someone told me to. I'm writing because I need you to understand something, even if you never forgive me. I spent 15 years being afraid that I wasn't enough, afraid that if you were in the picture, everyone would see how much better you were than me, afraid that our parents would realize they had been wasting their love on the wrong daughter. That fear consumed me. It became the lens through which I saw everything. Every success you had felt like a failure for me. Every time someone praised you, I heard criticism of myself. I couldn't be happy for you because your happiness felt like a threat to my existence. I know now that none of that was true. You were never trying to compete with me. You were just living your life, building something meaningful, trying to stay connected to a family that I was actively turning against you. But back then, I couldn't see it. All I could see was my own terror of being insignificant. My therapist calls it a scarcity mindset, the belief that there's only so much love and success and recognition to go around, and that if you have some, there's less for me. I've been operating from that belief my entire adult life, and it's destroyed almost everything that mattered. Marcus is gone. He filed for divorce last month. I don't blame him. I wouldn't want to be married to the person I was either. Mum and Dad still talk to me, but things are different now. They look at me like they're not sure who I am anymore. Maybe they're right to wonder. The only thing I'm certain of anymore is that I was wrong about you. You were never my enemy. You were never trying to take anything from me. You were my sister, and I should have loved you instead of trying to destroy you. I'm learning slowly what it means to be accountable without making excuses. My therapist says that's the hardest part for people like me, people who have spent years justifying their behaviour. But I'm trying. Not for Marcus, not for Mum and Dad, not even for you, for myself. Because I don't want to be this person anymore. I don't expect forgiveness. I know I haven't earned it, and I know I may never earn it. What I did to you, what I did to our family can't be undone with apologies or therapy sessions or letters written on a Tuesday night. But I hope someday we might talk. Not about the past necessarily, maybe just about ordinary things. The weather, a book you read, a recipe Mum sent you. I hope someday I might know my sister as a real person, instead of the threat I turned you into in my mind. You were never my enemy, Holly. I was my own enemy, and I blamed you for it. I'm sorry. Dara. I read the letter twice, then a third time. The plane continued its steady journey through the sky, carrying me home to a life that looked nothing like it had 3 months ago. I did not know how to feel. There was no surge of forgiveness, no sudden warmth toward the sister who had caused me so much pain. But there was also no anger. The rage that had burned so hot during that dinner at La Maison had faded over time, replaced by something quieter, something that might have been the beginning of acceptance. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. I would not respond yet, maybe in a few months, maybe longer. The relationship with Dara was not healed, and I was not sure it ever would be. Too much had happened. Too many years had been lost, but the door was not locked. It was just closed for now. When I landed, I took a car back to my apartment. The city lights glittered outside the window as we drove through streets I knew by heart. This was my home now. Not the house where I grew up, not the town where my parents still lived, but this place I had built for myself through years of work and determination. The next few weeks settled into a new rhythm. Sunday calls with my parents continued, and they were getting easier. We laughed more, now talked about real things instead of tiptoeing around the years of distance. Dad's health was stable, and he had started walking every morning, determined to be around for years to come. Mum kept sending recipes. I kept trying to make them. My attempts were getting better, though I still could not replicate her chicken casserole exactly. Maybe I would visit soon and have her teach me in person. At work, my new role as senior partner brought new challenges and responsibilities, but I found that I enjoyed it more than I had expected. The recognition was nice, but what mattered more was the work itself, the chance to help companies survive and families keep their livelihoods. My friends knew my real story now. Not the sanitized version I had told for years, the vague explanation about being distant from my family. The truth. They had listened, some with tears in their eyes, and they had supported me without judgment. I had people in my life who saw me clearly, who loved me for who I actually was. One evening, sitting on my couch with a glass of wine, I realized something that stopped me mid-sip. I was not dreading anything. For years, there had always been something. The next family gathering I would have to avoid. The next holiday I would spend alone. The next lie I would have to tell about why I never went home. But now, for the first time in nearly a decade, there was nothing to dread. Just life stretching out ahead of me, full of possibility. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was simply Holly. A woman with a complicated family and a meaningful career and friends who cared about her. A woman who had survived something painful and come out the other side changed but not broken. My phone buzzed with a text. I glanced at the screen and saw Mum's name. Coming home for Dad's next birthday. I smiled, not because I felt obligated, not because I was trying to prove I belonged, but because I wanted to. Because these were my parents, flawed and imperfect, and finally seeing me clearly, and I wanted to be with them. I typed back, "I'll be there." Then I set down my phone and looked out the window at the city lights. The story of my family did not end with happily ever after. There were still wounds that needed time to heal, relationships that might never fully recover, a sister I did not know if I could ever trust again. But that was okay, because healing is not a destination, it is a direction. And I was finally moving forward. Looking back on everything that happened, I sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if that dinner at La Maison had gone differently. If the manager had not recognized me. If Mr. Williams had not happened to be dining there that night. If Dara had managed to keep her composure just a little bit longer. But I've learned that wondering about what might have been is a waste of energy. The truth came out the way it was meant to. The lies that had separated me from my family for 8 years finally crumbled, and we were left to rebuild from the rubble. It has not been easy. Healing never is. There are still moments when the old pain surfaces, when I remember what it felt like to believe my parents did not love me. There are still awkward silences during our Sunday calls, still topics we avoid because we are not ready to face them yet. But we are trying, all of us, and that is more than I ever thought I would have. My father's health is improving. He walks every morning now, and he calls me sometimes just to tell me about a bird he saw or a neighbour he ran into. These small conversations mean more to me than any grand gesture ever could. My mother sends me recipes and photos of her garden. She is learning to ask questions about my work instead of changing the subject. We are building something new brick by brick, conversation by conversation. As for Dara, I still have not responded to her letter. I read it again last week, sitting in my office after a long day, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the beginning of understanding. She was wounded too in her own way. That does not excuse what she did, but it helps me make sense of it. Someday, maybe we will talk. Someday, we might sit across from each other and have an honest conversation about everything that happened. But that day is not today, and I have made peace with that. What I want you to take from my story is this: you are not invisible. No matter what anyone has told you, no matter how many years you have spent believing you do not matter, you are seen. You are valuable, and you deserve to be known for who you truly are, not for the stories others tell about you. Your worth is not determined by the people who failed to see it. Your value does not depend on recognition from those who should have loved you better. If my story resonated with you, if you found yourself nodding along or wiping away tears, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me your thoughts. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was working against you behind your back? Or maybe you are on the other side carrying guilt for things you have done to someone you love. Whatever your experience is, your voice matters here. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories about family and betrayal and the long road to healing, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who might be feeling invisible right now and needs to know they are not alone in this struggle. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here with me through this entire journey. And remember, no matter how dark things seem right now, healing is always possible. It is not a destination you arrive at one day and stay forever. It is a direction you choose again and again with every step you take. Keep moving forward. Your story is not over yet.